Before you were allowed to matter in the Gilded Age, you first had to be noticed. And that notice did not come from money, ambition, or power, but from one woman who decided whether you existed at all. The room waits in disciplined silence. Chandeliers glow, silverware rests untouched, and conversations hover just below confidence. Every guest knows the truth, even if no one dares say it aloud. This evening does not begin until Caroline Astor arrives. Fortunes have been made outside these walls, railroads carved across continents, industries bent to will, but none of it guarantees a place here. In this world, wealth opens doors, but acceptance opens society. And acceptance is not purchased, it is granted. If you enjoy stories where elegance conceals authority and politeness becomes a form of power, take a moment now to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. These stories unfold slowly, and they reward patience. Caroline Astor understood what her age, refused to admit that the Gilded Age was ruled not by democracy or merit, but by permission. Invitations were not gestures of kindness, they were judgments. Calling cards unanswered were not accidents, they were sentences. To be acknowledged by her was to be legitimate. To be ignored was to discover that success meant nothing without recognition. She ruled without spectacle, no proclamations, no scandals, only lists, seating charts, and an unspoken social arithmetic that decided who belonged among the elite and who would forever remain outside the velvet rope. Old names survived because she allowed them to. New fortunes rose only when she deemed them safe to stand beside tradition. This is not simply a tale of balls and gowns, but of control wrapped in civility, of how one woman became the final authority of American high society. This is the story of the Queen of the Gilded Age and how she decided who was elite. The Gilded Age did not begin with elegance. It began with noise. Factories roared along riverbanks and rail lines split the countryside into measured parcels of profit. Smoke climbed without apology into the sky, staining the air with the scent of coal and ambition. Fortunes appeared almost overnight, vast and unseasoned, born not of lineage, but of leverage, steel, oil, shipping, speculation. America did not merely grow rich, it surged unevenly and without instruction until wealth itself became common enough to lose its meaning. Money flooded New York in waves too fast to be absorbed. Mansions rose before traditions could catch up. Marble staircases led nowhere certain. Drawing rooms glittered, yet lacked agreement on who should occupy them. The old families, those whose names had once carried weight through generations of land, marriages, and carefully guarded memory, watched as newcomers arrived with pockets full and manners untrained. The city expanded upward and outward, but its social foundation began to slip. This was the quiet crisis beneath the celebration. Wealth multiplied, but order did not. In earlier eras, hierarchy had been slow and visible. Titles passed downward, names accumulated gravity through time. In this new age, money moved faster than reputation, and success outpaced acceptance. A man could command thousands of workers, influence elections, and bend markets, yet find himself unacknowledged in the drawing rooms that claimed to represent refinement. The contradiction unsettled everyone. If wealth no longer determined rank, then what did? The answer was not written anywhere. It hovered, unspoken, in the pauses between introductions and the careful scrutiny of faces at dinners. Society had become crowded without becoming coherent. Everyone could see the confusion. No one wished to admit it. To do so would suggest that progress had arrived without guidance, that America had learned how to make money before it learned how to live with it. Manners rushed in to fill the void. Etiquette hardened quickly, not as courtesy but as defense. Rules multiplied: who could call, who must wait, how long one should linger, which invitations required return, and which did not. These rituals were not ornamental, they were mechanisms. They sorted, filtered, and slowed the tide. Politeness became a method of control, and restraint became proof of belonging. Yet even these rules required interpretation. Someone had to decide which customs mattered, which names carried legitimacy, which fortunes were safe to acknowledge. Without agreement, etiquette risked becoming another chaos, different in form, but no less destabilizing than unchecked wealth. New York sensed this long before it named it. Conversations circled the problem indirectly. The city spoke of taste, of breeding, of the right sort, while carefully avoiding the deeper fear beneath it, that without a central authority, society itself might fracture into competing performances of refinement. Everyone could host a ball. Not everyone could make it matter. What the age demanded was not another industrial titan or political figure, but something far subtler, a stabilizing presence capable of turning abundance into hierarchy. Someone whose judgment would not appear forceful, yet would be obeyed. Someone whose authority would feel inevitable rather than imposed. The conditions were already set. Wealth had done its work, and in doing so had created its opposite, anxiety. The city glittered, but it also waited. It waited for permission, for definition, for a voice quiet enough to be trusted and firm enough to be final. The Gilded Age did not crown its rulers with ceremony. It allowed them to emerge through necessity. And in the midst of this excess, this surplus of money without meaning, the stage was prepared for a different kind of power to take shape. Not loud, not public, but absolute all the same. The old names did not vanish when the money arrived. They lingered, quiet but watchful, like portraits left hanging in rooms that had been redecorated too quickly. These families had learned long ago how power survived, not by display, but by continuity. Their wealth moved slowly, often invisibly, passed through trusts, marriages, and habits so ingrained they no longer felt like strategy. They did not announce themselves. They were already assumed. Then came the new fortunes, restless, immense, and impatient. Men whose fathers had kept shops or farms now commanded empires of steel, oil, shipping, rail. Their success was undeniable, their influence measurable in miles of track and columns of smoke. They built houses that imitated European palaces with American urgency, filling them with imported art, oversized furniture, and a hunger to be recognized. Yet for all their abundance, something essential was missing. Their names carried no sediment of time. They had weight, but no echo. This imbalance unsettled both sides. The newly wealthy believed achievement should speak for itself. They had mastered markets, crushed competitors, bent labor and law to their will. Why then did doors remain closed? Why were their wives greeted with politeness but not warmth, their invitations accepted cautiously, their presence tolerated but not embraced? They had bought everything else. It was intolerable to discover there was one thing money could not command. The old families, meanwhile, recognized the threat even as they depended on it. Their own fortunes, often diminished or carefully conserved, could not compete with the raw scale of industrial wealth. Yet, what they possessed was something the newcomers desperately lacked: legitimacy. To surrender that too easily would be to dissolve entirely, absorbed into a society where distinction meant nothing more than net worth. So an unspoken standoff formed. The old names closed ranks, emphasizing lineage, subtlety, restraint. They spoke less of money and more of background, character, fit. The new fortunes responded with spectacle, larger balls, louder charity, headlines engineered to force attention. Each side misunderstood the other. The newcomers mistook silence for snobbery. The old families mistook visibility for vulgarity. Both feared irrelevance, though neither would admit it. This tension reshaped social life into something brittle. Dinners became tests. Introductions carried weight far beyond politeness. A misplaced joke, an overeager gesture, an incorrect assumption could linger for years, quietly disqualifying a family from further consideration. There were no written rules explaining these failures, only patterns that repeated themselves with cruel consistency. Some doors, once closed, did not reopen. What made the situation unbearable was its ambiguity. There was no tribunal to appeal to, no public rejection to argue against. One was simply not included. The absence of acknowledgement did its work in silence, leaving the excluded unsure whether they had failed, offended, or simply been deemed unworthy. The city itself absorbed this friction. New York grew anxious in its elegance. Its wealth glittered more brightly than ever, yet its social atmosphere tightened, as though afraid to expand too freely. Everyone sensed that something had to give. Either the old names would be overwhelmed by sheer financial force, or the new fortunes would be compelled to submit to an authority that could translate money into meaning. What neither side yet fully understood was that neither could win alone. The old families lacked the power to enforce their standards openly. The new rich lacked the patience to wait indefinitely. What was required was mediation, a figure who could appear neutral while quietly deciding outcomes, someone who embodied continuity without being trapped by it, someone who could accept wealth without surrendering control. The clash between old names and new fortunes was not merely social discomfort. It was the precondition for rule. In the space between inherited prestige and purchased power, a new kind of authority was forming, one that would not eliminate hierarchy, but redefine it. And soon, New York would discover that its greatest conflict had already created the solution that would govern it. There came a moment in the Gilded Age when wealth itself seemed to hesitate. It was everywhere, stacked in banks, embedded in buildings, and moving through ledgers with relentless precision, yet it no longer guaranteed arrival. Men who could bend markets discovered they could not bend rooms. Women whose jewels caught every candle flame found that brilliance alone did not secure permanence. The city glittered, but recognition had become selective, almost stingy, as though society were rationing attention. This was the first great shock of the age, the realization that money had limits. For decades, success had followed a predictable rhythm. Accumulate capital, display it appropriately, and acceptance would follow. But New York had outgrown that simplicity. Too many fortunes rose at once. Too many households demanded acknowledgement. If all wealth were treated equally, then none of it would feel special. Distinction, once diluted, threatened to disappear entirely. And so money stopped being a conclusion and became merely an introduction. The newly rich learned this slowly and painfully. They hosted lavish gatherings only to find that the right guests declined or arrived briefly before leaving early. They endowed institutions and charities only to discover their names spoken politely but without enthusiasm. They appeared in newspapers yet failed to appear in conversations that mattered. Public success no longer translated into private validation. The frustration was not only personal, it was existential. To possess vast wealth and remain socially peripheral was an insult the age had not prepared them for. America had promised that achievement would be rewarded. Yet here was a realm where achievement required translation, where money needed approval before it could become meaning. The invisible barriers were more confounding than any legal restriction. There were no contracts to challenge, no competitors to crush, only an opaque system that answered to no market. Logic. Meanwhile, those already established watched carefully. They understood that allowing money to dictate rank would render their own advantages obsolete. If wealth alone defined worth, then history, discretion, and restraint would evaporate under the pressure of scale. The old families did not oppose money. They feared disorder. They feared a society where nothing endured long enough to command respect, where yesterday's fortune replaced today's before either could settle into tradition. Thus, they did not reject the new rich outright. They delayed them. Delay became a tool, subtle, effective, deniable. Invitations arrived slowly, if at all. Introductions were postponed. Relationships stalled in polite limbo. This suspension created a proving ground without rules. Those who grew impatient exposed themselves. Those who pressed too hard revealed insecurity. Only a few learned to wait, to observe, to restrain their eagerness and mimic the stillness of legitimacy. Yet even patience required guidance. The system, if it could be called that, was fragile. Without a central authority, standards varied from household to household. One family admitted a newcomer, another refused them. The same name might be welcomed one season and ignored the next. The uncertainty produced tension not just among outsiders, but within society itself. If no one could reliably interpret the rules, then the rules lost power. Money, stripped of its certainty, had created a vacuum. It was no longer enough to have wealth. One had to demonstrate taste, but taste according to whose measure? One had to show restraint, but who decided what counted as excess? The city required a singular reference point, someone whose judgment could settle disputes without ever appearing to do so. This need did not arise from ambition, but from exhaustion. New York was tired of deciding anew each season who mattered. It wanted stability, predictability, and above all, a sense that inclusion meant something beyond numbers. The age had produced unprecedented riches, but it had failed to produce consensus. And in that failure, a different kind of power was preparing to emerge, one that would not compete with money, but quietly stand above it. Money had built the world of the Gilded Age, but it could not organize it, and that insufficiency would soon belong to someone else. Before authority settled into a single figure, New York existed in a state of refined uncertainty. The city was confident in its wealth, but unsure of itself socially. Its avenues widened, its buildings climbed, its theaters glittered. Yet beneath the polish lingered a collective hesitation, as though everyone sensed that something essential had not yet taken shape. Society moved forward, but without a center. It was a body without a spine. Drawing rooms functioned as provisional courts. Families tested their influence nightly, hosting dinners meant to declare status rather than share pleasure. Yet each household operated by its own logic. One door opened easily, another closed without explanation. Reputation traveled unevenly, shaped by rumor rather than decree. A name could be praised in one parlor and dismissed in another, leaving its bearer suspended between validation and doubt. This fragmentation exhausted the city. Without a recognized arbiter, social life became labor. Attendance required calculation. Invitations were weighed for strategic value. Alliances formed tentatively, then dissolved when another household offered better positioning. Everyone watched everyone else, measuring gestures, noting absences, storing impressions that might matter later. The effort to appear effortless became relentless. What New York lacked was not ambition, nor refinement, nor even tradition. It lacked finality. In older societies, hierarchy had been inherited or imposed. Titles clarified place. Courts enforced rank. Even rebellion acknowledged the structure it resisted. New York, by contrast, had wealth without lineage and freedom without agreement. Its elites had no shared reference point, no single voice capable of saying this is enough, this belongs, this does not. The city tried to substitute volume for clarity. Balls grew larger, guest lists expanded, then contracted in reaction. Charity galas multiplied, each claiming moral authority. Newspapers, breathlessly, reported who attended what, attempting to manufacture hierarchy through repetition. But attention was not judgment, and publicity could not replace legitimacy. Being seen was not the same as being accepted. Beneath the spectacle, anxiety deepened. Hosts feared overreaching. Guests feared misreading signals. Families worried that one ill-considered association might undo years of careful positioning. Silence acquired weight. Absence became louder than presence. Every season felt provisional, as though society were waiting for confirmation that had not yet arrived. Even the most powerful sensed their vulnerability. Industrial titans, accustomed to command, discovered discomfort in this environment. They could dictate wages, influence legislation, shape markets, yet here they waited. Their success placed them at the edge of recognition, but not beyond it. They were visible, discussed, envied, yet still unanchored. The city admired them without surrendering to them. Old families, too, felt the strain. They had survived by discretion, but discretion alone could not enforce boundaries forever. Without consensus, their standards risked erosion. If too many exceptions were made, distinction would dissolve. If too few, irrelevance loomed. They required reinforcement, not through confrontation, but through consolidation. The paradox sharpened. Everyone wanted order, but no one wanted to appear responsible for imposing it. Authority, to be effective, would need to feel natural rather than declared. It would have to arise from custom, not coercion. It would need to operate through invitation rather than command, absence rather than punishment. In short, it would need to look like etiquette while functioning as law. New York, restless and overfed, was preparing itself for such power. The signs were subtle. Conversations increasingly deferred to certain opinions. Hosts quietly adjusted lists based on unspoken cues. Names were mentioned with growing frequency, not for their wealth, but for their judgment. The city was learning to listen without realizing it was doing so. Before the throne was occupied, it had to be imagined. And New York, fractured, glittering, and tired of deciding, was already arranging the room. Beneath the satin and chandeliers, beneath the rituals repeated until they appeared timeless, there lived a fear few in New York would ever name aloud. It was not fear of poverty. That belonged to another world. It was not fear of scandal either, which could be managed, softened, or outlived. This fear was quieter and far more corrosive. The fear that society itself might lose coherence, that distinction would dissolve into noise, that refinement would become indistinguishable from display, that anyone might claim belonging simply by insisting loudly enough. The Gilded Age had created too much too quickly. Too many fortunes arrived without apprenticeship, too many households appeared without memory, too many names demanded recognition without having earned the patience of time. If all were admitted, then admission meant nothing. If all were equal, then hierarchy, a structure upon which manners, deference, and continuity depended, collapsed inward. What followed would not be equality, but chaos. New York's elite sensed this instinctively. They spoke of it obliquely, in phrases that sounded harmless but carried warning. Standards are slipping. Society is becoming vulgar. Things are not what they used to be. These were not nostalgic complaints. They were defensive signals. The city was losing its ability to distinguish. Without distinction, there could be no authority. Every gathering risked dilution. Every introduction carried the danger of excess. Each new acceptance raised the question of who would come next and whether there would ever be a stopping point. The fear was not that the wrong people might enter, but that there would be no such thing as wrong anymore. This anxiety shaped behavior more than ambition ever did. Hosts hesitated before extending invitations, weighing not affection, but consequence. Guests monitored one another closely, gauging not enjoyment, but alignment. A wrong association could ripple outward, altering how an entire family was perceived. Social life hardened into vigilance, its pleasures subdued by calculation. Yet vigilance required agreement. And that agreement did not exist. Each household feared becoming the one that conceded too much, that admitted too freely, that weakened the collective boundary. But no household wished to be seen as exclusionary either. Open rejection carried social cost. It invited conflict, resentment, and accusation. The age preferred restraint to confrontation, subtlety to refusal. Thus, exclusion became indirect, and therefore unstable. The absence of a shared standard meant fear fed upon itself. If one family admitted a newcomer, others felt pressured to follow or risk appearing obsolete. If one refused, others worried they might seem inhospitable or insecure. Decisions were made defensively rather than deliberately, driven by anxiety rather than confidence. This was the true crisis of the Gilded Age's social world, not wealth, not ambition, but the terror of losing, control without knowing how to preserve it. The city needed reassurance. It needed someone whose judgment could relieve others of the burden of deciding. Someone whose acceptance could be trusted, whose refusals could be interpreted as protection rather than insult. Someone who could say enough without ever saying it aloud. Without such authority, the fear would intensify. Manners would become sharper, politeness colder, inclusion rarer and more arbitrary. Society would fracture into competing circles, each claiming legitimacy while quietly doubting its own. The very elegance New York prized would curdle into suspicion. What the age required was not expansion, but containment, not innovation, but consolidation. The fear of social chaos did not announce itself with panic or protest. It whispered through drawing rooms and lingered in pauses between greetings. It revealed itself in the careful narrowing of guest lists and the sudden weight given to certain opinions. And as that fear deepened, New York did what it always did when faced with uncertainty. It waited for someone to decide. When formal authority failed to appear, etiquette stepped forward to take its place. It did not announce itself as power. That was the brilliance of it. Manners arrived disguised as kindness, tradition, and taste. Soft-spoken rules that claimed only to smooth interaction, never to govern it. Yet in the Gilded Age, these customs hardened into something far more binding than law, precisely because they pretended not to be. Manners required no enforcement, they enforced themselves. A rule written on paper invites challenge. A rule embedded in behavior becomes invisible. By the time New York realized etiquette had become compulsory, it was already too late to resist. One did not break social codes openly, one simply vanished from relevance. Every gesture carried weight. How long a caller waited before leaving a card, whether a hostess returned it, which invitation was answered promptly, and which was acknowledged only after delay. These details, seemingly trivial, accumulated into judgments that could shape a family's future for decades. Manners became a language of consequence, fluent to insiders, baffling to those who had arrived too recently to understand its grammar. The beauty of this system lay in its deniability. No one was ever accused. No charge was spoken aloud. A family excluded from a season's gatherings could not protest without appearing crude. To demand explanation was itself a violation. Silence served as verdict, and politeness ensured compliance. Etiquette proved far more efficient than confrontation. It allowed society to regulate itself without admitting it was doing so. Inclusion appeared voluntary, yet it followed patterns too consistent to ignore. Those who mastered restraint advanced quietly. Those who displayed eagerness stalled. Excess, whether of speech, wealth, or emotion, marked a person as unready, no matter how impressive their fortune. Manners did not reward virtue. They rewarded control. This was especially true for women, who became both guardians and instruments of the system. Their behavior reflected not only personal standing, but familial legitimacy. A misjudged remark, an overly familiar tone, a public eagerness to be admired, these could undo years of careful positioning. Women were trained to sense these boundaries instinctively, to navigate them without acknowledgement, and to enforce them without appearing to do so. Men built fortunes. Women preserved order. The rigidity of these customs was often mistaken for elegance. In truth, it was fear refined into ritual. Manners protected society from unpredictability. They slowed entry. They filtered newcomers. They ensured that acceptance, once granted, felt earned, even if the criteria were never stated. Yet this system carried a weakness. Etiquette, to function as law, required interpretation. Someone had to decide when a rule applied, when it could be bent, and when it must not be. Without such interpretation, manners risked becoming inconsistent, applied harshly in one household, leniently in another. Authority scattered is authority diminished. The city felt this instinctively. People began to watch not just behavior, but response, whose invitations were accepted without question, whose judgments were repeated, whose absences altered plans. Etiquette alone was no longer enough. It required a center, a figure whose taste could standardize custom, whose restraint could legitimize restraint itself. Until then, manners operated as provisional law. They governed without appeal. They punished without accusation. They preserved hierarchy while pretending to merely preserve harmony. And as New York leaned more heavily on these invisible rules, it grew increasingly clear that etiquette, powerful though it was, could not rule forever on its own. Every law, however subtle, eventually demands a judge. An invitation in the Gilded Age was never a courtesy. It was a decision. Its paper was thick, its lettering restrained, its language impeccable, and its meaning unmistakable to those who understood the world it governed. To receive one was not merely to be welcomed for an evening, but to be recognized as acceptable. To be passed over was not an accident of numbers or space. It was assessment rendered quietly, without explanation or appeal. In a society without titles or formal ranks, invitations became verdicts. Every gathering announced who mattered now. Guest lists functioned as living documents, constantly revised, scrutinized, and remembered. A name appearing consistently signaled stability. A name appearing once suggested trial. A name that vanished altogether told its own story, one spoken only in whispers, if at all. What made invitations so powerful was their ambiguity. They did not explain themselves. They arrived, or they did not. Their absence could be attributed to coincidence, oversight, or scheduling conflict. Yet everyone understood the truth beneath these excuses. Politeness provided cover, but not comfort. Families waited entire seasons for acknowledgement that never came, forced to decide whether to persist or quietly retreat. The judgment embedded in invitation was absolute, precisely because it was never spoken. To question it was to expose insecurity. To protest was to confirm unfitness. The rules were clear only in their consequences. Those who grasped this adapted. Those who did not were taught slowly and painfully through exclusion. Hosts understood the weight they carried. Every invitation extended risked association. Admit too freely and prestige thinned. Admit too cautiously and relevance faltered. The act of inviting became a balancing exercise, less about hospitality than about curation. Who sat beside whom mattered, who arrived together mattered, who declined mattered most of all. Attendance itself became a signal. To accept an invitation was to endorse the host's standing. To refuse, especially without reason, could wound deeply. Powerful families noticed who came, who lingered, who left early. Social capital circulated not only through inclusion, but through selective absence. Thus, invitations linked households into a web of mutual surveillance. One dinner influenced the next. One acceptance opened doors elsewhere. One omission echoed across seasons. No single event determined fate, but patterns accumulated relentlessly. The city remembered everything while pretending to forget. For newcomers, this system proved maddening. They mistook quantity for success, hosting grand events, inviting widely, hoping to force acknowledgement through scale. But excess signaled desperation. The most coveted invitations were never numerous. They were limited, deliberate, and difficult to obtain. The newcomers' eagerness betrayed their uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place in elite society. Old families, by contrast, practiced scarcity. They invited rarely, declined often, and spoke little of it. Their restraint communicated confidence. An invitation from them carried weight precisely because it was not easily given. When it arrived, it felt earned, even if the criteria remained invisible. The power of invitation transformed social life into a series of auditions without stages. No one was ever told they were being evaluated. They simply felt it. Every interaction carried consequence. Every gesture might be remembered. Every absence might be interpreted. The city lived inside a permanent examination it never acknowledged. What made this system sustainable was its cruelty without confrontation. No host needed to explain their choices. No guest could demand inclusion. Judgment occurred silently, its effects undeniable, yet its process hidden. Responsibility dispersed, accountability evaporated, and authority became impossible to locate. But systems like this do not remain diffuse forever. When judgment grows powerful enough, it seeks consolidation. When invitations decide worth, someone must eventually decide which invitations matter most. The city could not endure endless interpretation. It required consistency, someone whose invitations ended debate rather than invited it. Invitation had become judgment, and judgment was already searching for a single hand to hold it. Exclusion in the Gilded Age rarely announced itself. It did not arrive with confrontation, nor with rejection plainly spoken. It came instead through omission, an absence so carefully managed that it could not be challenged without humiliation. This was its power. This was its cruelty. To be excluded was not to be insulted. It was to be erased. A family might realize, slowly, that their invitations were no longer reciprocated, that their presence was no longer requested, that acquaintances who once lingered now glanced past them in rooms grown, suddenly unfamiliar. Nothing dramatic occurred, no scene unfolded. Life continued, outwardly unchanged. And yet, something essential had been withdrawn. Exclusion operated on time rather than force. Weeks passed, then seasons. One waited, uncertain whether silence meant delay or decision. The lack of clarity prevented outrage. Perhaps the hostess had forgotten. Perhaps the season was smaller this year. Perhaps the city had simply been busy. Each possibility allowed hope to persist just long enough to prevent resistance. This was the quiet violence of polite society. It denied even the dignity of knowing when one had fallen. For those accustomed to achievement, this form of punishment proved unbearable. In business, failure announced itself clearly. In politics, opposition could be confronted, but social exclusion offered no opponent, no appeal, no recovery strategy. One could not argue one's way back into relevance. One could only wait, and waiting often made things worse. Families responded differently. Some retreated, selling houses, traveling abroad, convincing themselves they had outgrown New York. Others redoubled their efforts, hosting ever more elaborate gatherings, mistaking visibility for acceptance. Both responses confirmed the judgment already rendered. Withdrawal signaled defeat, excess signaled desperation. The truly dangerous response was to speak of it. To acknowledge exclusion openly was to violate the central rule of the system, that nothing important was ever discussed directly. Those who voiced their grievances exposed themselves as unfit, unable to bear silence with dignity. Society punished them further, not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Open emotion threatened order. What made exclusion so effective was its collective nature. No single household could be blamed. Responsibility dissolved into custom. One hostess followed another's lead. One absence justified the next. The city moved as a unit without admitting it was doing so. Those excluded could not identify who had decided their fate because no one had decided it openly. This created an atmosphere of permanent caution. Everyone learned to read signals obsessively. A delayed reply became ominous. A shorter conversation raised suspicion. A missed gathering suggested reclassification. Social life ceased to be lived. It was monitored. Even the secure felt vulnerable, aware that inclusion was conditional, always subject to revision. Yet, exclusion was not random. It followed patterns invisible only to those who refused to see them. Excessive ambition, insufficient restraint, unfamiliar lineage, unapproved associations, these accumulated quietly until silence replaced acknowledgement. The process felt personal, but it was procedural. Society removed what unsettled it, not with anger, but with indifference. This was how order was maintained without cruelty ever being named. Exclusion spared society the embarrassment of enforcement. No rules were cited, no boundaries drawn. Those who did not belong simply drifted outward, as though guided by gravity rather than will. The city preserved its image of civility while practicing a form of social elimination as final as any decree. And yet, the very effectiveness of this violence revealed its flaw. Such power, dispersed and unclaimed, created fear even among those it protected. If exclusion could occur without explanation, then inclusion offered no security. If silence could erase, then silence could threaten anyone. New York was beginning to realize that invisibility, once weaponized, required stewardship. Someone would need to decide when exclusion was justified, when it had gone far enough, and when it should end. Otherwise, the system risked turning inward, devouring its own. The violence was quiet, but it was already demanding a keeper. There came a point when New York's social world stopped advancing and began to pause. The city still moved. Carriages rolled, dinners were hosted, invitations circulated. But beneath the motion lay hesitation. Decisions that once felt instinctive now felt weighted. Invitations were drafted, revised, and sometimes never sent. Conversations stalled at polite surfaces, careful not to reveal too much eagerness or too much doubt. Society had learned collectively and without instruction to hold its breath. This restraint was not calm. It was anticipation. Everyone sensed that the system could no longer sustain itself in its current state. Exclusion had grown too effective, too pervasive. Etiquette had hardened into an unspoken judiciary, yet no one knew who truly presided over it. Judgment circulated everywhere and nowhere at once. The absence of final authority had begun to feel dangerous. People began to wait for cues, not explicit ones, those would have been vulgar, but subtle confirmations. A certain name mentioned with approval, a certain gathering spoken of as decisive, a certain opinion repeated until it acquired the weight of consensus. Social confidence no longer came from wealth or lineage alone, but from alignment with something not yet fully visible. The city's elite were adjusting without acknowledging it. Hosts delayed hosting, guests delayed committing. Alliances formed tentatively, then paused, as though awaiting confirmation from an unseen source. No one wanted to move first. To act prematurely risked misalignment. To misalign was to expose oneself to the quiet violence of exclusion. Thus, restraint became universal. The most telling change was not who attended gatherings, but how they behaved once there. Conversations grew cautious, almost reverent. Guests observed one another more than they spoke. Every gesture was measured, every comment calibrated. The ease that once accompanied wealth had been replaced by something closer to discipline. This collective hesitation produced an odd stillness. The city glittered more than ever, yet felt oddly suspended. It was as though society had reached the edge of a decision it did not know how to make on its own. The abundance that once promised freedom now demanded structure. The freedom that once celebrated individuality now required containment. No one said this aloud. Instead, it manifested in imitation. People watched certain households closely, noting their timing, their guest lists, their absences. Patterns emerged. Certain invitations, when extended, altered behavior elsewhere. Certain silences carried authority. The city began to defer instinctively, not knowing to whom it deferred. This was how power announces itself before it is named, not through command, but through anticipation, not through declaration, but through alignment. People began to behave as if someone were already deciding, even though no one could yet point to who that was. The effect was profound. Social confidence migrated upward, away from the newly wealthy and toward those who appeared most composed under this pressure. Restraint became proof of legitimacy. Those who could wait seemed secure. Those who could not revealed themselves. The city rewarded patience not because it was virtuous, but because it suggested access to hidden assurance. The breath being held was not fear of change, but fear of choosing incorrectly. Everyone sensed that once authority settled, it would settle completely. There would be no appeal, no negotiation, no rotation. The arbiter, once recognized, would define boundaries for an entire generation, and so society delayed, suspended between possibilities, unwilling to commit until commitment was unavoidable. This waiting sharpened attention. Eyes followed certain figures more closely. Opinions once dismissed began to carry unexpected influence. Invitations from specific households caused ripples. Absence from certain gatherings became conspicuous. The city was teaching itself where to look. Before the crown appears, a society rehearses obedience. New York had not yet named its queen, but it had already begun to wait for her. Power rarely announces its absence. It reveals itself through discomfort. By the close of this unsettled decade, New York's social world had become exquisitely sensitive to imbalance. The city no longer argued about wealth, nor even about taste. Those debates had exhausted themselves. What remained was a collective unease, a sense that decisions were being made everywhere and nowhere at once, that judgments were multiplying without coordination, that authority had fragmented into 1,000 careful silences. This was the vacuum. It was not empty in the obvious sense. It was crowded with opinions, customs, rituals, and unspoken rules. Yet none of these possessed finality. Each household interpreted etiquette slightly differently. Each hostess enforced boundaries according to her own instinct. Each influential name carried weight, but not enough to settle disputes beyond a single room. The result was friction without resolution. New York society functioned, but it did not cohere. Invitations circulated, but they did not conclude argument. Exclusion occurred, but it did not feel settled. A family might be ignored in one circle and tentatively welcomed in another, suspended between acceptance and dismissal. Such ambiguity drained confidence from even the most established. What the city felt, though it could not articulate it, was fatigue. Deciding required energy. Interpreting signals required vigilance. Maintaining status demanded constant calibration. Even those securely placed felt the strain of perpetual awareness, of watching, adjusting, withholding. The performance of refinement had become relentless, and refinement, when overperformed, loses its grace. The elite understood this intuitively. They sensed that elegance required restraint not only in behavior, but in judgment. Too many judges cheapened the verdict. Too many interpretations weakened the rule. Manners, powerful as they were, had reached the limits of what they could enforce without consolidation. The vacuum was not a lack of ambition. It was a lack of arbitration. No single household wished to claim authority openly. To do so would invite resentment, challenge, and scrutiny. Open power remained distasteful. The age preferred influence that could deny itself, authority that appeared inevitable rather than asserted. Thus, the vacuum waited, not for force, but for recognition. Certain patterns had already begun to emerge. Some opinions were repeated more often than others. Some invitations carried disproportionate influence. Some absences reshaped entire seasons. These were not accidents. They were early signals, trials of gravity, testing which figures could bend the social field without visible effort. The city responded instinctively. Hosts deferred, guests adjusted. Alignments formed quietly, without declaration. New York was practicing obedience without admitting it. It did not yet know whom it was obeying, only that alignment felt safer than independence. This is how authority is born in polite societies, not through conquest, not through proclamation, but through relief. Relief that someone else might decide, relief that ambiguity might end, relief that the burden of judgment could be transferred to a figure whose taste felt trustworthy, whose restraint felt stabilizing, whose decisions would spare others the risk of choosing incorrectly. The vacuum did not require a tyrant. It required a custodian, someone capable of translating abundance into hierarchy, someone whose refusals would be accepted as protection, not insult, someone whose approvals would feel like confirmation rather than favoritism. Someone who could say this belongs without ever speaking the words. By the time such a figure appeared, the city would recognize her immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she resolved tension. The waiting would end. The breath would be released. Power in New York was ready. All it needed was a form refined enough to hold it. Carolyn Astor did not enter society so much as inherit it. From the beginning, expectations surrounded her like architecture, solid, enclosing, quietly directive. It was not expressed in instruction, nor enforced through discipline. It existed as atmosphere. Certain behaviors were assumed, certain silences were required, certain choices were never presented as choices at all. To be born into position was to understand without explanation that one's role was not to disrupt the room, but to stabilize it. Her upbringing did not teach ambition, it taught calibration. Where others learned to advance, Caroline learned to observe. She absorbed the rhythms of conversation, the weight of pauses, the importance of restraint. She learned which gestures invited attention and which commanded it without asking. These lessons were never spoken aloud. They were demonstrated, repeated, and absorbed until they became instinct. Expectation did not burden her. It shaped her. Unlike those who would later struggle to acquire legitimacy, Carolyn did not chase recognition. She had no need to perform arrival. Her position preceded her presence. This allowed a freedom others never possessed, the freedom to wait. Waiting in her world was not delay, it was confirmation. Her family's standing provided insulation from urgency. There was no rush to prove worth, no compulsion to display success. Time itself functioned as endorsement. Names endured because they had endured. Caroline learned early that stability, not visibility, was the truest mark of authority. This upbringing fostered a particular discipline. She learned to speak sparingly, to listen attentively, to reveal nothing that could be used against her. Emotion was not suppressed but managed. Opinion was not absent but softened. These habits did not diminish her presence, they sharpened it. In rooms crowded with assertion, restraint became unmistakable. Expectation also carried obligation. To belong was not merely to benefit, but to preserve. The social order she inherited depended on continuity, not innovation. Carolyn understood that disruption threatened not only hierarchy, but security itself. Her role was not to redefine society, but to keep it legible, to ensure that distinctions remained visible, that boundaries held, that refinement did not dissolve into noise. This sense of custodianship marked her profoundly. She did not view society as a stage for personal expression, but as a system requiring maintenance. Every admission altered balance, every exclusion carried consequence. Decisions mattered precisely because they were permanent. This awareness fostered caution, but also confidence. She would not decide lightly, but once decided, she would not reverse herself. Expectation prepared her for influence by discouraging spectacle. Those raised without position often mistook attention for power, Carolyn understood the difference. Power, she learned, functioned best when unnoticed. It operated through trust, repetition, and predictability. Her manner reflected this philosophy. She did not seek to be admired, she sought to be relied upon. This distinction would later define her authority. Where others reacted to the chaos of the Gilded Age with anxiety or display, Caroline responded with stillness. Where others rushed to adapt, she allowed the world to come to her. Expectation had trained her to assume continuity, to believe with quiet certainty that order would require her presence. She did not yet rule, she did not yet decide, but she had been shaped from the beginning to do both without appearing to do either. In a city desperate for stability, Caroline Astor's greatest advantage was not wealth, nor lineage, nor even influence. It was preparation so complete that it felt invisible. She was born into expectation, and expectation would soon learn to depend on her. Marriage in Caroline Astor's world was never romantic scaffolding, it was structure. It joined families the way beams join walls, quietly, decisively, and with consequences that lasted longer than affection ever could. Love, if it appeared, was tolerated. Compatibility was preferred. What mattered most was alignment, of name, of habit, of expectation. A marriage that failed to support the social structure weakened everything built upon it. Caroline understood this before she could have articulated it. She had watched unions praised not for tenderness, but for suitability. She had seen how a well-chosen match stabilized fortunes, repaired reputations, and preserved lineage without spectacle. Marriage was not a culmination, it was a continuation, a method by which order perpetuated itself without the embarrassment of enforcement. When Caroline married, she did not step into a partnership of equals in the modern sense. She entered an arrangement of roles, carefully, balanced and deliberately maintained. Her husband's position provided public authority, hers supplied social coherence. This division was neither accidental nor unfair by the standards of the age. It was efficient. Men could build, women could bind. Caroline's role was not to dominate the household, but to organize it, to ensure that its outward expression matched its inward intention. She controlled rhythm rather than direction, timing rather than declaration. In this way, marriage became an extension of her training, an environment where influence functioned best when it appeared natural. The household itself became a model. Guests observed how evenings unfolded, how conversations flowed, how boundaries were maintained without discomfort. Nothing felt imposed, nothing felt improvised. The architecture of the home, physical and social, communicated stability. People left feeling reassured, even if they could not say why. This was not accident, it was design. Marriage offered Caroline something essential: legitimacy without exposure. As a wife, she occupied a position that invited trust rather than suspicion. Influence exercised within domestic space appeared benign, even maternal. Decisions made there felt less like judgments and more like custom. This allowed her to observe widely while remaining unchallenged. From her vantage, she learned how alliances formed and dissolved, how families tested one another, how ambition revealed itself through impatience. Marriage did not restrict her perception, it sharpened it. She saw patterns others missed because they were too busy asserting themselves. Crucially, marriage taught her the value of permanence. Affairs faded, fortunes fluctuated, reputations rose and fell, but households endured. Their stability, or lack of it, signaled reliability. Caroline internalized this lesson deeply. She did not pursue novelty, she cultivated continuity. In a society overwhelmed by change, this instinct would prove invaluable. Marriage also disciplined visibility. A wife was expected to be present but not prominent, influential but not vocal. This constraint became Caroline's advantage. She learned how to guide outcomes without claiming authorship, how to shape consensus without appearing to seek it, how to allow others to believe they had arrived at decisions independently. These were not manipulations. They were accommodations to reality. In a world that resisted overt female authority, Caroline mastered the indirect. Marriage provided the framework within which she could operate effectively, protected by convention and expectation. Her influence grew precisely because it was never framed as ambition. By the time the Gilded Age's social vacuum widened, Caroline had already internalized its solution. She understood that order required architecture, structures invisible enough to be trusted, stable enough to endure. Marriage had taught her how to build such structures patiently, without fanfare. She did not need to announce herself. She had been practicing authority all along, within the walls that made authority appear effortless. Silence, for Caroline Astor, was never absence. It was instruction. Long before she exercised authority, she absorbed it by withholding herself. She learned, early and thoroughly, that speech could diminish presence as easily as it could enhance it. Words, once spoken, could be questioned, misremembered, repeated without consent. Silence, by contrast, retained its shape. It suggested judgment without revealing it. It invited interpretation while remaining immune to correction. This lesson was not taught explicitly. It was modeled. She watched rooms change when certain figures entered, how conversations slowed, how tone adjusted, how others unconsciously deferred. These figures did not dominate discussion. They allowed discussion to orbit them. Their authority lay not in what they said, but in what others hoped they might say. Caroline learned to recognize this gravity, and more importantly, how it was cultivated. Silence required confidence. One could only afford not to speak if one's position was secure enough to survive ambiguity. For the uncertain, silence was dangerous. It could be mistaken for ignorance or weakness. For the established, it functioned as proof of composure. Caroline, insulated by expectation, learned to wait before responding, to allow others to reveal themselves first. In this way, silence became a diagnostic tool. Those who rushed to fill it exposed eagerness. Those who over-explained betrayed anxiety. Those who spoke carelessly revealed impatience. Caroline observed all of this without appearing to observe at all. Her restraint invited disclosure. People confided, speculated, justified themselves in her presence, assuming neutrality where there was only attention. She did not interrupt. Interrupting asserted dominance too openly. It disrupted flow. It suggested insecurity. Caroline allowed conversations to complete themselves, even when they circled foolishly or revealed too much. This patience gave her an advantage others mistook for passivity. She learned more by listening than most ever learned by speaking. Silence also protected her. In a social world governed by memory, spoken opinion carried risk. Alliances shifted, reputations changed. A remark that pleased one season might offend the next. By remaining measured, Caroline avoided entanglement. Her views were inferred rather than recorded. This allowed her to adapt without appearing inconsistent. Crucially, silence preserved mystery. Mystery, in polite society, was power. The unknown invited caution. People hesitated to offend what they could not predict. Caroline did not cultivate mystery deliberately. She simply refrained from resolving herself into something easily understood. This restraint encouraged others to project stability onto her, to assume judgment where none had been expressed. She learned, too, that silence could be used to close doors without confrontation. A delayed response, an unanswered card, a gentle deflection offered without explanation. These gestures spoke loudly while appearing courteous. They avoided the vulgarity of refusal while accomplishing its purpose. Caroline mastered these techniques not as weapons, but as maintenance, ways to preserve order without conflict. Silence shaped her temperament. It trained her to tolerate discomfort, to resist the impulse to clarify, to endure ambiguity without seeking relief. In a society that punished emotional exposure, this endurance proved invaluable. She could sit with uncertainty while others unraveled around her. By the time New York began to search for authority, Caroline had already internalized its language. She understood that power in polite society did not announce itself. It waited. It listened. It allowed others to exhaust themselves against its stillness. Silence was not retreat. It was position. And Caroline Astor had learned early and well how to hold it. In a society obsessed with visibility, Caroline Astor learned to treat appearance as restraint rather than display. Clothing, posture, expression, none of these existed to attract attention. They existed to prevent it from straying. Appearances, properly managed, reassured others that order was intact, excess unsettled, novelty disturbed, consistency calmed. Caroline absorbed this logic until it became instinctive. She dressed not to be admired, but to be unremarkable in the most deliberate way. Her gowns followed fashion without chasing it. Colors were chosen for harmony rather than impact. Jewelry suggested inheritance, not acquisition. Nothing announced novelty. Everything suggested continuity. This discipline extended beyond clothing into gesture and bearing. She moved without haste. She smiled without indulgence. Emotion was present, but filtered, never sharp enough to disrupt the yabaisi room. Appearance, she understood, was a language. It communicated allegiance to stability. It signaled that nothing unexpected would occur under her watch. In an age where fortunes rose and fell violently, this calm exterior became profoundly reassuring. People trusted what did not surprise them. Caroline's appearances promised predictability in a world grown erratic. This discipline was not passive, it required constant awareness. She understood that one visible misstep could outweigh years of restraint. A moment of excess, too much ornament, too bold in opinion, too visible in ambition, could fracture the image she maintained. Appearances, once damaged, were difficult to restore. Society remembered deviations more clearly than consistency. Thus, she cultivated repetition. Each season resembled the last just enough to feel reliable. Her presence did not evolve dramatically, it deepened. People grew accustomed to her steadiness. Familiarity bred trust rather than contempt because it reinforced the idea that she was permanent, that she would not disappear, nor radically transform, nor demand reevaluation. This was a rare quality in the Gilded Age. New money announced itself with change. New houses, new styles, new entertainments appeared with exhausting frequency. Caroline's discipline offered contrast. Her consistency felt anchoring. Where others experimented, she maintained. Where others reacted, she absorbed. Appearance also functioned as boundary. Her composure discouraged intimacy without requiring rejection. People did not overshare with her. They did not challenge her. They adjusted themselves in her presence, lowering volume, refining language, smoothing edges. This was not intimidation. It was alignment. Her discipline invited others to discipline themselves. The effect was cumulative. Over time, people stopped asking what Caroline preferred and began assuming it. Her tastes became reference points. Her approval, even when unspoken, carried weight. Her disapproval, expressed only through subtle withdrawal, carried consequence. Appearances had done their work. She did not instruct society. She trained it. This discipline extended to the spaces she controlled. Rooms were arranged for balance rather than spectacle. Gatherings unfolded with deliberate pacing. Nothing felt forced, yet nothing was accidental. Guests left with the impression that events had simply gone well, without recognizing how carefully outcomes had been guided. In this way, appearance became infrastructure. It supported authority without exposing it. It allowed Caroline to exercise influence while remaining above accusation. She did not decide loudly. She set conditions under which decisions became obvious. By the time the Gilded Age began searching for someone to stabilize its social world, Caroline Astor had already been doing so, quietly, consistently, and in full view. The discipline of appearances had prepared her for rule. All that remained was for society to recognize what it had already begun to obey. What Caroline Astor gave mattered less than what she chose not to give. In a society addicted to display, withholding became her most effective instrument. Attention, approval, access. These were currencies more volatile than money and far more difficult to replace once denied. Caroline understood this instinctively. Generosity could be imitated, restraint could not. To give freely was to flatten distinction, to give selectively was to create it. Withholding did not announce itself as refusal. That would have been crude. It arrived as delay, a response postponed, an invitation not extended this season, a conversation gently redirected before it settled into intimacy. These gestures preserved civility while asserting control. They allowed Caroline to shape outcomes without confrontation, to regulate access without appearing to regulate anything at all. The power of withholding lay in its ambiguity. Those affected could never be certain whether they had been judged or merely overlooked. This uncertainty discouraged protest. It invited self-correction. Families adjusted their behavior, refined their presentation, waited longer, spoke less, hoping alignment would be rewarded. Withholding transformed desire into discipline. Caroline never explained herself. Explanation diminished authority. It invited negotiation. By offering none, she preserved finality while avoiding responsibility. Others filled the silence with interpretation, and interpretation did the work she never claimed to do. The city learned to read her pauses as meaning, her restraint as verdict. This practice required patience. Withholding operated slowly, often across seasons. A single omission meant little. A pattern, repeated quietly, reshaped reputation. Caroline trusted time to clarify intention. She did not rush outcomes. She allowed them to settle, confident that permanence favored restraint. Those who grew impatient revealed themselves. They pressed for acknowledgement, sought reassurance, demanded clarity. Each demand disqualified them further. The art of withholding punished eagerness without appearing to punish anything at all. It rewarded those who could endure uncertainty, who could maintain composure without validation. In this way, withholding functioned as a filter. It separated those capable of self-regulation from those driven by appetite. The Gilded Age produced abundance. Caroline cultivated scarcity. Scarcity heightened value. It also restored hierarchy. Not everyone could be everywhere. Not everyone could be known equally. Someone had to decide where the lines fell. Caroline did so by not moving them. Her standards remained fixed, not because she was inflexible, but because flexibility invited chaos. Change occurred only when it could be absorbed without disruption. Admission was slow, deliberate, and often unacknowledged even when granted. This prevented triumph from becoming spectacle. Those accepted learned to behave as though they had always belonged. Withholding also protected Caroline herself. By offering little of her inner life, she remained difficult to approach and impossible to manipulate. Praise could not inflate her. Criticism could not wound her publicly. She occupied a position insulated from extremes. This insulation allowed her to act as custodian rather than participant, arbiter rather than rival. Others misread this restraint as coldness. They mistook warmth withheld for absence of feeling. In truth, Caroline felt keenly, but she did not confuse feeling with expression. Expression carried consequence. She preferred consequence to remain on her terms. The city adapted. People learned that approval from Caroline could not be earned through force or display. It arrived only when need had subsided, when ambition had been tempered, when behavior aligned naturally with her expectations. Withholding taught patience. It also taught obedience, not obedience, to her as a person, but to the system she embodied. By the time New York began to speak of standards as though they were fixed rather than negotiated, Caroline Astor had already established them by offering less than anyone expected and thereby making what she offered decisive. The art of withholding did not deprive society, it disciplined it. What Caroline Astor trusted more than wealth, more than enthusiasm, even more than correct behavior, was memory. Not personal recollection, but social memory. The slow accumulation of familiarity that transformed names into institutions. Lineage, in her understanding, was not merely ancestry. It was endurance. A family proved itself not by arriving impressively, but by remaining intelligible over time. To be remembered consistently, without explanation, was the highest credential society could offer. The Gilded Age strained this principle. Fortunes appeared too quickly to acquire memory. Names surged into prominence, without context, demanding recognition before they had earned repetition. Society, overwhelmed by novelty, risked forgetting itself. Carolyn recognized this danger immediately. Without memory, hierarchy collapsed into improvisation. Without lineage, legitimacy became temporary. Thus, she privileged what could be recalled. Families who had endured, who had been present quietly season after season, were trusted not because they were superior, but because they were predictable. Their behavior could be anticipated. Their responses could be relied upon. They did not require explanation because they had already been explained by time. This preference was often misunderstood. Newcomers accused Carolyn of favoritism, of nostalgia, of resisting progress. In truth, she resisted instability. Lineage was not a moral claim, it was a structural one. A society could absorb change only if some elements remained fixed. Memory provided that anchor. Social memory also functioned as instruction. Children learned how to behave not from rules, but from precedent. They observed which families were deferred to, which names carried weight, which absences mattered. This education occurred without commentary. It was absorbed through repetition. Caroline understood that to disrupt lineage too aggressively was to sever this transmission, leaving society untrained. Thus, she advanced cautiously. New families were not excluded outright, they were observed across time. One season proved nothing. Several seasons revealed pattern. Could they sustain restraint? Could they absorb correction without resentment? Could they participate without dominating? Only after such questions answered themselves did Caroline allow memory to begin forming around them. This process felt slow to outsiders. They mistook delay for rejection. They did not understand that haste itself disqualified them. Lineage could not be manufactured. It could only be accumulated. Those who attempted to compress time through spectacle revealed their incompatibility with permanence. Caroline's reliance on social memory also limited her own power. She did not invent hierarchy from nothing. She curated it. She reinforced patterns already present, formalizing them through repetition. Her authority felt natural because it aligned with existing memory rather than contradicting it. People recognized her judgments because they resembled what they already believed, only clarified. This was her genius. She did not demand that society accept new rules. She reminded it of old ones it had begun to forget. Lineage in her hands became not an obstacle to change, but a filter for it. What could not endure did not belong. What endured required no defense. Memory also allowed exclusion to feel impersonal. A family might be denied not because of offense, but because they lacked context. They had not yet been seen enough. They had not been present long enough to be trusted. This rationale spared Caroline from appearing punitive. She did not reject, she deferred. Time, not temperament, became the explanation, and time favored those already aligned. In this way, social memory became the quiet engine of control. It rewarded patience, consistency, and self-restraint. It discouraged volatility. It slowed ambition until it either refined itself or collapsed. By the time the Gilded Age reached its height, Caroline Astor had transformed lineage from inheritance into qualification. Memory, not money, determined belonging. And because memory could not be purchased or hurried, it restored hierarchy without ever naming it. Society did not argue with this system. It remembered itself into obedience. In a world driven by acceleration, Caroline Astor discovered that the rarest posture was immobility. The Gilded Age rewarded motion. Fortunes were made through expansion, conquest, and relentless forward push. Railroads stretched endlessly westward. Industries devoured competitors. Houses grew, larger each season, as though size alone could guarantee permanence. Everything moved, too quickly, too loudly, too visibly. Caroline did not. Her stillness was not inertia. It was refusal. She declined to match the tempo of the age, and in doing so, set a counter-rhythm that others instinctively adjusted to. Where motion suggested appetite, stillness suggested sufficiency. She behaved as though nothing needed to be proven, because for her, nothing did. This posture unsettled people. Those accustomed to competition searched for signals, approval, resistance, reaction. Caroline offered none immediately. She listened. She waited. She allowed conversations to run their course without interruption, allowed enthusiasm to exhaust itself without encouragement. This patience created imbalance. People revealed more than they intended when faced with silence that did not rush to reassure them. Stillness became leverage. In social settings, she rarely initiated. She responded only when response would clarify rather than clutter. Her presence slowed rooms. Conversations softened. Guests became more careful, more deliberate, not because she demanded restraint, but because her restraint made excess feel conspicuous. This effect multiplied quietly. Others began to mirror her pace. Invitations timed themselves around her availability. Decisions were postponed until her opinion could be inferred. Absence in her case was never neutral. It reshaped plans. It signaled that something remained unresolved. Stillness also protected authority. Movement invites scrutiny. Action exposes intention. By remaining still, Caroline avoided both. Her decisions appeared less like choices and more like inevitabilities. When change occurred, it felt organic rather than imposed. People adapted without resistance because they believed the shift had always been underway. This illusion of inevitability was crucial. Authority in polite society depends not on force, but on acceptance. Acceptance is easier when power feels natural, when it seems to arise from circumstance rather than will. Caroline's stillness suggested she was not striving for influence, merely inhabiting her position. Others granted authority to her because it did not appear to be claimed. Stillness also required discipline. It demanded tolerance for uncertainty. While others rushed to secure advantage, Caroline waited through ambiguity. She trusted that impatience would disqualify competitors before she ever needed to intervene. In this way, stillness functioned as a test. Those who could not endure it revealed themselves as unsuitable. The city learned from her example. New York's elite began to equate calm with legitimacy. Loud success grew suspect. Rapid ascent became alarming. Those who paused, who moved carefully, who refrained from excess began to appear reliable. Caroline had not instructed this shift. She had modeled it. Her stillness created hierarchy without announcement. Those closest to her, pace benefited. Those who refused to slow down drifted outward. The system sorted itself. This was the elegance of her approach. It required no enforcement. It produced no scandal. It merely rewarded alignment. By the time observers recognized stillness as power, it had already reshaped behavior. Caroline Astor did not need to command attention. Attention adjusted itself to her. In a society frantic with accumulation, her refusal to hurry became the clearest signal of all. She did not move because she did not need to. And in that immobility, authority settled, quietly, completely, and without challenge. Caroline Astor did not advance toward authority. Authority advanced toward her. This distinction mattered. In a society alert to ambition, those who sought influence openly were resisted. Their eagerness betrayed insecurity. Their efforts invited competition. Caroline did neither. She remained where she had always been, composed, consistent, and unmoved by the frantic recalculations of others. Over time, this constancy produced gravity. People began to adjust around her. At first, the changes were subtle. Invitations were scheduled with her calendar in mind. Conversations paused when her opinion might be inferred. Hosts weighed guest lists against her known preferences, careful not to misalign themselves. No announcement marked this shift. It emerged through repetition, as habits often do. Unavoidability is not visibility. It is consequence. Caroline's presence altered outcomes even when she was not present. A gathering held without her required explanation. An alliance formed without her acknowledgement felt provisional. Her absence carried interpretive weight, forcing others to account for it in ways that quietly reinforced her position. This effect compounded. Each deference justified the next. Each adjustment normalized the behavior. Soon, alignment with Caroline's standards ceased to feel strategic and began to feel necessary. Not because she demanded it, but because divergence introduced risk. The safest course was to move as though her judgment mattered, because it increasingly did. Unavoidability does not announce itself through command, it reveals itself through inevitability. Those who attempted to bypass her influence discovered that success elsewhere did not translate upward. A family might dominate a particular circle, yet stall when attempting broader recognition. Their reach exceeded their legitimacy. They had achieved prominence without consolidation. Caroline's quiet absence from their ascent marked its ceiling. This was not punishment, it was clarification. Caroline did not block paths, she defined where they ended. Her authority functioned less like a barrier and more like a horizon, an outer limit beyond which advancement lost coherence. One could operate without her, but only within confined scope. As this reality settled, behavior changed. Ambition softened, display diminished, patience increased. People learned to wait, not because they were told to, but because waiting felt prudent. Caroline's stillness had trained the city to move more slowly, to test alignment before advancing. She did not monopolize social life, she stabilized it. This stabilization made her indispensable. Hosts relied on her judgment to reduce risk. Guests trusted her standards to validate participation. Even rivals depended on her presence to confer legitimacy upon their own success. Opposition to her influence weakened because it lacked an alternative. There was no competing center, no parallel authority capable of absorbing the same burden. Attempts to challenge her position dissolved quietly. Those who sought to assert independent authority discovered how exhausting it was to maintain without recognition. Influence without acceptance required constant reinforcement. Caroline's authority required none. It rested on habit, memory, and relief, the relief of having someone else decide. This relief was her greatest asset. In an age overwhelmed by choice, she narrowed options. In a society strained by uncertainty, she provided reference. People did not resent this limitation, they welcomed it. It spared them from error, it protected them from exclusion. It made social life legible again. Caroline Astor became unavoidable, not because she demanded obedience, but because she absorbed responsibility. Others could host, others could exclude, others could judge, but only she could do so without destabilizing the whole. By the time New York recognized that it had begun to revolve around her, the recognition changed nothing. The orbit was already established. Movement had adjusted. Resistance had become irrelevant. Caroline Astor had not seized power. She had become the condition under which power functioned at all. Rivalry requires proximity. It demands comparable ambition, visible competition, and the belief that the same prize can be seized by different hands. Caroline Astor occupied a position where none of these conditions applied. By the time her authority settled into place, it had moved beyond contest. There was nothing left to challenge because there was nothing left to imitate convincingly. Other women held influence, none held finality. Society admired hostesses, celebrated fashion leaders, whispered about social climbers who dazzled for a season. These figures attracted attention, even devotion, but their power remained situational. It depended on novelty, on effort, on constant reaffirmation. Caroline's authority required none of this. It existed whether she was admired or not. This difference eliminated rivalry before it could form. To compete with Caroline Astor would have required adopting her methods, restraint, patience, withholding, stillness, while lacking the inheritance of trust that made those methods effective. Imitation without legitimacy revealed itself quickly. Those who attempted it appeared. Cold rather than composed, distant rather than dignified. What worked for Caroline because of expectation failed for others because it looked deliberate. Rivals need leverage. Caroline had none to expose. She did not chase influence, so she could not be accused of ambition. She did not flaunt power, so she could not be resented for excess. She did not speak decisively in public, so she could not be contradicted. Every avenue of opposition dissolved upon approach. Even criticism struggled to attach itself. To condemn her openly was to misunderstand her role. She had not imposed herself, she had been accepted. She had not excluded aggressively. She had merely been selective. She had not disrupted society. She had stabilized it. Attacking her authority meant attacking the comfort she provided, and few wished to do that. This left potential rivals in an impossible position. They could oppose her only by offering an alternative structure, another center capable of absorbing judgment, enforcing standards, and relieving anxiety. No one could replicate this without appearing authoritarian. Caroline's power rested precisely in her invisibility. Any overt challenger exposed themselves as grasping. Thus, rivalry remained theoretical. Women of ambition circled her, sought her approval, adjusted their behavior in her presence. Some mistook proximity for competition. It was not. Caroline did not share space, she defined it. Those near her operated within her atmosphere, not against it. Men, too, recognized the futility of opposition. Industrial magnates wielded enormous economic power, yet none attempted to dictate social order directly. They understood instinctively that authority imposed from outside would be resisted. Caroline's influence succeeded because it appeared endogenous, emerging from society rather than ruling it. She was not a gatekeeper standing in the way. She was the gate itself. This distinction mattered profoundly. Rivals require edges, places to push against, seams to exploit. Caroline offered none. Her standards were consistent, her behavior predictable, her decisions aligned with long-established patterns. Nothing about her authority felt arbitrary, even when it was absolute. As a result, challenge never cohered. There were moments of resentment, certainly. There were whispered frustrations, quiet grievances, private fantasies of displacement. But resentment is not rivalry. It lacks coordination, it lacks confidence, it lacks a path forward. Caroline's position endured because it was solitary, not lonely, solitary. She did not share power because sharing would have weakened it. She did not delegate judgment because dispersion would have reintroduced chaos. She did not cultivate successors because succession implies replacement, and replacement invites contest. There would be no second Caroline Astor. By the height of her influence, this truth had settled into the city's consciousness. Society no longer searched for alternatives. It no longer speculated about rivals. It adjusted itself instead, accepting that legitimacy passed through a single point of reference. A woman without rivals is not merely powerful, she is uncontested. And in the Gilded Age, where everything else competed relentlessly for dominance, Caroline Astor stood alone, not because she excluded challengers, but because none could ever reach her. Caroline Astor never sat upon a throne, yet everyone behaved as though she did. There was no ceremony to mark her ascent, no declaration announced her authority, no title formalized her position, and yet, by the height of the Gilded Age, her judgment carried the force of law, her approval conferred legitimacy, and her silence could halt ambition mid-stride. Power had gathered around her so completely that it no longer required recognition to function. This was the genius of her rule. It was uncrowned. A crown invites scrutiny. It invites challenge. It invites succession. Caroline's authority avoided all three by refusing to name itself. She did not claim dominance. She occupied necessity. Society deferred to her not because she demanded obedience, but because her presence resolved uncertainty. In an age saturated with wealth and anxious for order, that resolution was invaluable. Her home became a center without resembling a court. There were no guards, no proclamations, no rigid hierarchy enforced at the door. And yet, the rules were clearer there than anywhere else. Behavior softened upon entry. Speech refined itself. Guests instinctively adjusted tone and posture as though stepping into a space already governed. No one needed to be told how to act. They felt it. This atmosphere extended far beyond her walls. An invitation associated with Caroline's approval carried weight elsewhere. A guest seated beside her gained standing without explanation. A family acknowledged by her found doors opening with surprising ease. Conversely, her absence from certain circles marked their limits unmistakably. Society read these signals fluently, rarely questioning their legitimacy. The throne without a crown worked because it felt earned rather than imposed. Caroline's authority aligned with what society already wanted but could not organize on its own. She embodied continuity in a time of disruption. Her restraint countered excess. Her patience countered haste. Her consistency countered volatility. In submitting to her judgment, society did not feel conquered. It felt relieved. She governed through pattern, not command. The same standards applied season after season. Admission followed observation. Favor followed endurance. Nothing about her rule felt impulsive. Even rejection appeared procedural rather than personal. This predictability made her authority feel just, even when it was unforgiving. Crucially, she never appeared to enjoy power. Enjoyment would have suggested appetite, and appetite destabilizes trust. Caroline treated authority as obligation rather than privilege. She accepted its burdens without display, its benefits without indulgence. This detachment insulated her from envy and suspicion alike. Others might dominate a season. She governed generations. The absence of formal recognition also prevented consolidation against her. There was no institution to reform, no office to contest, no role to replace. Her power existed only through consensus, and consensus had already formed. Those who benefited from order protected it instinctively. Those excluded had no clear grievance to rally around. The throne remained invisible, yet immovable. Caroline's influence did not extend into politics or commerce directly. She did not need it to. By controlling legitimacy, she shaped outcomes indirectly. Alliances followed acceptance, reputations followed alignment, marriages followed approval. Her reach extended precisely because it was never acknowledged as reach. This was rule refined to its purest form. No spectacle, no enforcement, no resistance. By the time observers began to speak of her as queen, the title described a reality already complete. The crown had never been necessary. Authority had settled without it, resting securely in habit, expectation, and trust. Caroline Astor ruled without coronation, and because she never wore the crown, she never had to surrender it. Power, once established, seeks a form simple enough to endure. For Caroline Astor, that form became a list. It was never announced as such. It did not hang on walls or circulate openly. Yet everyone knew it existed, or believed they did, and belief was enough. The list functioned as an invisible boundary, a numerical restraint placed upon a society otherwise inclined toward excess. It transformed judgment into arithmetic, legitimacy into limitation. In a city overflowing with wealth, limitation became authority. The idea was deceptively modest. Society, to remain society, could not be infinite. If everyone were admitted, distinction vanished. If boundaries remained fluid, hierarchy dissolved. A list imposed clarity where manners alone had grown imprecise. It did not explain why one belonged. It simply answered whether one did. This answer carried finality. To be included was to be acknowledged as complete. To be excluded was to discover that something, lineage, restraint, endurance, remained insufficient. There were no appeals. The list did not argue. It endured. Names that appeared upon it acquired stability. Names absent from it hovered in uncertainty, regardless of wealth or prominence. What made the list effective was not its accuracy, but its authority. People adjusted their behavior around it instinctively. Invitations narrowed, guest lists contracted. Social ambition learned to recognize its ceiling. The city, once anxious with possibility, relaxed into structure. Knowing where one stood, even unfavorably, proved preferable to endless ambiguity. The list did not require enforcement. Hosts used it as reference without admitting to doing so. Guests measured themselves against it privately, rarely aloud. Newspapers alluded to it without describing it. The list governed through consensus rather than decree. Its power lay in the fact that everyone believed everyone else believed in it. Caroline Astor understood the psychology perfectly. A boundary felt arbitrary only when it shifted. Fixed limits, once accepted, felt natural, even merciful. By attaching legitimacy to a finite number, she transformed exclusion from a personal slight into a structural necessity. One could not argue with mathematics. One could only accept it. The list also protected those within it. Membership implied safety. It suggested that when it arrived not temporarily, but conclusively, families within its bounds no longer needed to perform. They could retreat into restraint, confident that their position would not be re-evaluated each season. This stability reinforced loyalty to the system that provided it. Those outside responded differently. Some withdrew quietly, recognizing finality when they encountered it. Others persisted, hoping for revision. But revision, if it occurred at all, happened slowly and without acknowledgement. A name might appear years later without explanation, as though it had always belonged. This preserved the list's authority by denying that it could be influenced. The city accepted this logic because it aligned with exhaustion. New York no longer wished to evaluate endlessly. It wanted closure. The list provided that closure without spectacle. It answered the unspoken question, who matters, without forcing anyone to speak the answer aloud. Carolyn did not publish the list. She did not need to. Its existence reshaped behavior without documentation. In this way, the list functioned less as a record than as a principle. Society must be small enough to remain legible. Scarcity restored meaning. The list ruled New York, not because it was fair, but because it was final. And finality, in an age overwhelmed by abundance, felt like mercy. The number itself mattered less than what it implied. 400 was not a census, it was a correction. In a city that had grown swollen with money, ambition, and visibility, the declaration of a finite elite functioned like a tightening breath. It did not describe society as it was, it described society as it should be, limited, disciplined, contained. The figure did not emerge from demographic study or historical precedent. It emerged from necessity, shaped by the practical limits of space, recognition, and endurance. 400 was small enough to matter. The phrase traveled quickly, not because it was official, but because it was useful. It reduced chaos to a number that could be imagined. People could picture 400 names. They could not picture thousands. The abstraction restored legibility to a social world that had become too large to interpret. This was Caroline Astor's quiet brilliance. She did not argue that society ought to be exclusive. She allowed others to conclude it themselves by presenting exclusivity as arithmetic. If society were to fit comfortably within the rooms that defined it, it could not exceed their capacity. The drawing rooms of legitimacy were finite, therefore, so must be the elite. The 400 did not merely exclude, it reordered perception. Those within its imagined boundary acquired an aura of completeness. They were no longer aspirants, they were settled. Their presence did not require justification. Their absence, by contrast, became conspicuous. To be seen everywhere except among the 400 was to discover the limits of one's influence. The number also disciplined those inside it. Membership was not license for excess, it was obligation to restraint. Those who belonged were expected to embody stability, not spectacle. Their behavior reflected upon the entire structure. A single indiscretion risked weakening the illusion of coherence upon which the number depended. Thus, the 400 became custodians of their own boundary. They guarded it instinctively, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. To expand the circle was to dilute it. To dilute it was to reintroduce the chaos from which it had emerged. Inclusion became conservative, not because it was unkind, but because it was protective. For those outside, the number offered clarity, however painful. One could strive endlessly without knowing whether success would ever arrive, or one could accept that arrival had a limit beyond which effort no longer applied. The 400 resolved this ambiguity. It offered a final measure against which all ambition could be weighed. This did not eliminate desire. It disciplined it. Caroline Astor did not enforce the number personally. She did not issue decrees or confirm rosters. She allowed the idea to circulate until it governed behavior on its own. Hosts trimmed lists, guests recalibrated expectations, social life reorganized itself around the assumption that space was scarce and legitimacy finite. The city adapted quickly. New York had always respected boundaries, so long as they appeared natural. The 400 felt natural because it reflected what many already believed, that not everyone could belong, and that pretending otherwise exhausted everyone involved. The number achieved something manners alone could not. It standardized exclusion without confrontation. It transformed judgment into limit. It allowed society to say enough without having to explain why. In doing so, it cemented Caroline Astor's authority not as a woman, but as a principle. The 400 did not need to be accurate. It needed to be believed. And belief, once established, reshaped New York more efficiently than any law ever could. To be admitted into Caroline Astor's world was not a moment. It was condition. There were no announcements, no congratulations, no public acknowledgement that a threshold had been crossed. One did not enter society so much as cease to be excluded from it. This distinction mattered. Applause would have suggested achievement. Achievement invited scrutiny. Caroline's system offered something subtler and far more durable: quiet acceptance. Those newly admitted often realized it only in retrospect. An invitation arrived without explanation. A name appeared on a guest list where it had never appeared before. A conversation once cautious now unfolded with ease. The shift was unmistakable, yet unspoken. To comment upon it would have been gauche. Gratitude, if expressed too openly, would have exposed the effort behind the arrival. Silence was the price of legitimacy. Caroline understood that celebration destabilized hierarchy. Triumph encouraged display. Display invited comparison. Comparison reintroduced rivalry. To preserve order, admission had to feel inevitable rather than earned. Those accepted were expected to behave as though they had always belonged. This expectation filtered behavior immediately. The newly admitted learned restraint quickly. They softened voices, moderated dress, and resisted the urge to host extravagantly. Excess would have betrayed insecurity. Those who indulged themselves revealed that they did not yet understand the rules and were quietly reclassified as provisional. Acceptance was not permanent by default. Caroline did not revoke membership openly, but she allowed it to erode. A family might remain technically admitted while drifting outward socially, their invitations fewer, their presence less necessary. This gradual withdrawal spared embarrassment while reinforcing standards. Admission required maintenance, not through effort, but through consistency. Those who understood this survived. They learned that legitimacy was not sustained by performance, but by invisibility. The less one called attention to oneself, the safer one became. Caroline rewarded those who absorbed this lesson fully. Their belonging felt secure because it required nothing. This approach discouraged gratitude as spectacle. Caroline did not want loyalty expressed through praise or allegiance. Such gestures personalized authority and risked resentment. Instead, loyalty manifested as alignment, hosts modeling her standards, guests adjusting behavior, families reproducing her restraint. The system perpetuated itself without instruction. Admission without applause achieved something remarkable. It prevented resentment among those still excluded. There was no moment to envy, no ceremony to resent. Exclusion remained ambiguous enough to endure without rebellion. People could believe they were simply early, not rejected. Hope softened disappointment just enough to preserve order. At the same time, admission felt weighty. Those who arrived understood they had entered something fragile. One misstep could undo years of patience. The absence of applause heightened caution. It reminded them that recognition could be withdrawn as quietly as it had been granted. Caroline Astor's genius lay in this balance. She made belonging feel both natural and conditional, safe, yet never guaranteed. This tension preserved discipline without cruelty. It trained society to regulate itself. By removing celebration from admission, she removed entitlement from belonging. No one felt owed a place. No one felt secure enough to challenge the system. Everyone behaved as though legitimacy were something to be protected rather than displayed. In this way, Caroline ensured that her society did not fracture under the weight of its own success. People entered without applause, and because of that, they stayed quietly, carefully, and exactly as she intended. Arrival, once imagined as triumph, proved to be something far more unsettling. Those who crossed into Caroline Astor's world quickly discovered that belonging did not bring relief. It introduced vigilance. The moment one ceased to be excluded, one began to fear being seen too clearly. Acceptance did not end scrutiny. It refined it. The newly arrived found themselves navigating a quieter, more exacting terrain, one where mistakes were rarer but far more consequential. This anxiety was not accidental. Caroline understood that certainty bred complacency, and complacency destabilized order. To preserve discipline, arrival had to feel provisional even when it was complete. Those admitted sensed this instinctively. They moderated themselves, softened opinions, resisted novelty. They learned to observe more than they acted. The fear was not of expulsion, but of misalignment. A misplaced enthusiasm, an association deemed imprudent, a display that suggested appetite rather than sufficiency. Each carried risk. The rules were not written, which made them harder to follow and harder to challenge. Anxiety flourished precisely because nothing could be confirmed openly. One could never ask whether one still belonged. One could only behave as though one did. This produced a peculiar stillness among the newly arrived. They deferred more often than those long established. They spoke carefully. They dressed conservatively. Their restraint sometimes bordered on stiffness, betraying the effort beneath the composure. Caroline noticed this but did not intervene. Time, she trusted, would either soften them or expose them. Arrival tested endurance. Those who could not tolerate uncertainty began to seek reassurance. They hosted excessively, overcorrected behavior, or aligned themselves too visibly with perceived authority. These efforts, meant to secure position, often undermined it. Anxiety, once visible, marked a person as not yet settled. The settled, by contrast, appeared indifferent. Families long accepted moved with ease. They risked little because they needed little. Their confidence came not from immunity, but from familiarity. They understood the rhythms of inclusion well enough to relax within them. Their calm served as a model and a reminder of how far the newly arrived still had to go. Caroline allowed this contrast to persist. It reinforced hierarchy without declaration. Arrival was not equalizing. It was stratifying. There were those who belonged effortlessly and those who belonged conditionally, even if both appeared within the same rooms. The difference was visible only to those trained to see it. Anxiety, then, became a signal. It revealed who still measured themselves against society rather than inhabiting it. Caroline did not punish this anxiety directly. She allowed it to resolve itself. Those who learned to absorb it quietly survived. Those who acted upon it drifted outward, not expelled but reclassified. This process preserved dignity. No one was publicly rejected. No scandal announced failure. The anxious simply found themselves less central over time, their presence less required, their influence less assumed. The system corrected itself without cruelty. Arrival also altered perspective. Those newly inside began to see exclusion differently. What had once felt unjust now appeared structural. They recognized the necessity of limits, the burden of judgment, the fragility of order. Sympathy for outsiders diminished, not out of malice, but out of comprehension. They had learned how difficult it was to maintain composure under scrutiny. Caroline's system converted aspiration into conservatism. Those who arrived became its defenders, not because they were instructed to be, but because they understood what they stood to lose. Anxiety bound them to the structure that produced it. In this way, arrival did not weaken Caroline Astor's authority, it deepened it. The anxiety of arrival ensured that belonging remained careful, disciplined, and self-policing, exactly as she required for her invisible throne to endure. OldMoney had never imagined itself obedient. It had grown accustomed to deference, not discipline. Its authority, inherited rather than earned, had long operated on assumption. Names carried weight because they always had. Doors opened because they always had. No explanation was required and none was expected. This quiet confidence had survived revolutions in commerce and taste alike, until Caroline Astor. At first, old families did not recognize the shift. They assumed her influence was ornamental, another hostess, another figure of social polish. They continued to behave as they always had, relying on precedent rather than adjustment. But precedent in a changing city, began to fail them. Invitations no longer arrived automatically. Absences began to matter. Behavior once tolerated now registered as careless. The realization came slowly and without drama. Their names alone no longer guaranteed centrality. This was unsettling. Old money had never needed to align itself consciously. It had been alignment. Now, alignment required maintenance. Caroline did not challenge lineage directly. She rendered it insufficient on its own. Endurance mattered, but so did behavior. Restraint mattered, timing mattered, memory mattered, but memory had to be curated. Some resisted. They dismissed Caroline's influence as temporary, her standards as fashionable rather than foundational. They hosted as they pleased, spoke freely, associated carelessly. Their miscalculations were never confronted. They were simply absorbed. Their presence became less essential. Their gatherings less attended. Their authority faded without conflict. Others adapted. These families recognized that Caroline's system did not erase lineage. It disciplined it. They adjusted tone, moderated display, and submitted quietly to standards they had not authored. This submission was not humiliation. It was survival. To remain central, they learned to accept guidance without acknowledgement. This was obedience refined. Caroline did not command old money. She conditioned it. Her authority did not replace theirs. It reorganized it. Families who aligned retained influence. Those who did not discovered that inheritance alone could not protect them from irrelevance. What made this obedience remarkable was its voluntariness. No one was forced. No rule demanded compliance. The consequences of divergence simply accumulated. Old money learned, through observation rather than instruction, that defiance had no audience and alignment had no downside. Caroline offered something old money lacked: coherence. Their power had been diffuse, spread across generations and households. Hers was singular. She did not compete with them. She coordinated them. In doing so, she preserved their relevance by subjecting it to structure. This arrangement benefited both sides. Old families gained protection from the chaos of new wealth. Caroline gained legitimacy rooted in history rather than novelty. Her authority felt less like innovation and more like stewardship. In obeying her standards, old money preserved the appearance of continuity, even as control subtly shifted. The obedience was quiet, almost reluctant, but complete. Families that once set tone now followed it. Those who once ignored social signals learned to read them carefully. Caroline's preferences became reference points, her silences warnings, her presence reassurance. What had begun as influence matured into expectation. Old money did not announce its obedience, it absorbed it. By the time resistance might have mattered, the system had already proven itself indispensable. Order had returned, anxiety had diminished, society had regained legibility. Even those who resented the loss of autonomy benefited from the stability it produced. In the end, old money did what it had always done best. It adapted to survive. And in adapting, it acknowledged, without ever saying so, that Caroline Astor now ruled the very class that once believed itself untouchable. New money arrived loudly, as if volume itself could substitute for history. It built quickly, decorated lavishly, and announced its success with a confidence born of survival rather than ease. Fortunes made within a lifetime carried a particular urgency, the need to be recognized before time could erode advantage. These families did not wish merely to be wealthy. They wished to be seen. Caroline Astor understood this impulse precisely because she did not share it. Where new money sought validation, she offered calibration. She did not reject it outright. That would have been impractical. The Gilded Age depended on expansion, and expansion required absorption. But absorption did not mean equality. It meant placement. New money, she decided, would not be denied entry. It would be taught restraint. At first, this felt like welcome. Invitations appeared, names circulated, access was granted selectively, enough to inspire confidence but not enough to confer security. New families mistook proximity for parity. They assumed presence implied approval. This misunderstanding was useful. It encouraged participation without granting authority. Caroline observed carefully. She watched how these families behaved once admitted to rooms they had long coveted. Did they dominate conversation? Did they overdecorate their homes? Did they confuse extravagance with refinement? These behaviors were not condemned openly. They were simply noted and remembered. New money learned quickly that enthusiasm had consequences. The more aggressively one sought recognition, the more one was managed. Invitations became conditional. Appearances became supervised. Advancements slowed. Carolyn's system allowed new wealth to circulate without allowing it to dictate terms. This distinction preserved order without discouraging growth. Those who learned adapted. They softened. They listened. They allowed others to lead. They abandoned novelty in favor of imitation, not mimicry of style, but adoption of restraint. These families progressed gradually, acquiring legitimacy not through display but through endurance. Those who did not learn stalled. They remained wealthy, visible, and restless, circling society without penetrating its center. Their gatherings attracted attention, but not authority. Their presence was tolerated, but not relied upon. They discovered, too late, that money could buy access but not position. Caroline never humiliated new money. She did not need to. The system corrected excess on its own. Those who pushed too hard encountered ceilings they could not explain. Those who waited discovered doors opening quietly, without announcement. The lesson was unmistakable. Legitimacy arrived only when one ceased to pursue it directly. New money learned its place not through rejection, but through containment. It was allowed to exist, even to flourish, but within boundaries set by others. Caroline ensured that innovation did not overwhelm continuity, that novelty did not destabilize memory. New wealth would be integrated only when it ceased to threaten coherence. This arrangement satisfied everyone involved. Old money felt protected. New money felt hopeful. Society regained balance. Caroline's authority appeared generous rather than punitive, adaptive rather than rigid. She was not resisting change. She was regulating its speed. Over time, the distinction between old and new softened, not because hierarchy vanished, but because behavior converged. Those who survived adopted the same discipline, the same stillness, the same caution. Wealth became less visible. Legitimacy became quieter. New money, once loud with arrival, learned to whisper. And in learning restraint, it accepted a truth the Gilded Age had struggled to articulate, that power without order exhausts itself, and that order, once restored, decides where everyone belongs. Caroline Astor did not deny new money a future. She taught it how to wait for one. Charity in the Gilded Age was never merely kindness. It was arrangement. Caroline Astor understood that generosity, when structured properly, could accomplish what authority could not openly demand. Charity allowed hierarchy to appear benevolent. It softened judgment with purpose. It transformed obligation into virtue and power into stewardship. She did not give impulsively. Every contribution carried intention. Every cause reflected alignment. Charity, in her hands, became a secondary language of inclusion, one that signaled who understood responsibility and who merely sought recognition. To give was not enough. One had to give correctly. This distinction mattered deeply. Many were wealthy enough to donate. Few were capable of doing so without spectacle. Public generosity exposed appetite. It suggested insecurity disguised as benevolence. Caroline avoided this trap entirely. Her charity was quiet, disciplined, and selective. It reinforced order, without inviting applause. She chose causes that stabilized society rather than disrupted it. Institutions over individuals, endurance over urgency. Hospitals, cultural foundations, and educational efforts that reinforced structure rather than sentiment. Charity, she believed, should repair without empowering chaos. It should alleviate without elevating. Compassion had to be regulated, or it risked undermining hierarchy. This philosophy shaped behavior beyond her own giving. Those seeking legitimacy learned quickly that charitable involvement was not optional, but neither was it performative. Supporting the wrong cause or supporting it too loudly signaled misalignment. Caroline never corrected such errors publicly. She simply noted them. Over time, patterns emerged. Charity became a test. Did a family understand restraint? Did they recognize continuity over novelty? Did they give as though obligation were natural rather than earned? Those who passed this test found doors opening, quietly. Those who failed remained peripheral, regardless of their generosity. This system disciplined empathy itself. It trained the elite to view responsibility as maintenance rather than rescue. The poor were to be supported, but not elevated. Institutions were to be strengthened, but not transformed. Charity preserved order by reinforcing existing boundaries under the guise of moral duty. Caroline's approach also neutralized criticism. Those who resented exclusion found it difficult to accuse a system so visibly benevolent. Charity deflected moral challenge. It reframed hierarchy as care. Those within the system appeared custodial rather than self-interested, even when outcomes favored them exclusively. This reframing was powerful. It allowed Caroline to enforce standards without appearing punitive. Exclusion was no longer cruelty. It was discernment. Limitation was no longer selfishness. It was stewardship. Society accepted these distinctions because they felt humane, even when they were restrictive. Charity also created networks of obligation. Those involved in shared causes developed loyalty not just to one another, but to the standards governing their participation. To deviate socially risked reputational consequences beyond drawing rooms. Philanthropic alignment reinforced social alignment. Caroline ensured these worlds overlapped deliberately. She did not invent this strategy. She refined it. Charity had always been a feature of elite life. Caroline transformed it into infrastructure. It stabilized her authority by extending it into moral space, territory far more difficult to challenge than etiquette alone. In doing so, she made hierarchy feel necessary rather than arbitrary. The city learned to associate legitimacy with responsibility, and responsibility with restraint. Charity, once sentimental, became procedural. It reinforced the same lessons society was already learning elsewhere, that belonging required discipline, patience, and alignment with order. Caroline Astor did not rule by force. She ruled by giving, carefully, quietly, and always in a way that ensured control remained exactly where she intended it to be. Taste, once personal, became instructional. In earlier generations, refinement had been inherited, absorbed through proximity, reinforced by repetition. By the height of the Gilded Age, this quiet transmission had fractured. Wealth moved too quickly. Families appeared without memory. Exposure outpaced understanding. Taste, unmoored from lineage, risked becoming performance. Caroline Astor recognized this danger immediately. If society were to endure, taste could no longer be assumed. It would need to be taught, carefully, indirectly, and without humiliation. Instruction could not resemble correction. Correction invited resentment. Instead, taste would be modeled so consistently that deviation felt conspicuous. This was the education she provided. She did not lecture. She curated. Her gatherings were classrooms disguised as evenings. Guests learned by observing what was present and, more importantly, what was absent. There were no excesses to admire, no novelties to distract. Everything appeared inevitable. This inevitability trained perception. People learned what to notice by noticing what she noticed. Conversation followed rhythm rather than volume. Decor emphasized balance rather than novelty. Even pleasure felt measured. Nothing demanded admiration. Everything rewarded attention. Taste emerged not as opinion, but as environment. This method favored the observant. Those capable of learning without instruction advanced. They absorbed cues, adjusted behavior, refined judgment. Those who required explanation stalled. They asked questions too openly, sought reassurance too visibly, revealed uncertainty through effort. Caroline did not correct them. She allowed their limitations to announce themselves. Taste became a test of adaptability. The truly adept understood that refinement was not static. It required sensitivity to context, to timing, to restraint. Caroline's standards evolved slowly, never abruptly. This gradual shift allowed those aligned with her pace to adjust naturally, while those clinging to spectacle fell behind without confrontation. Education occurred through repetition. Season after season, the same patterns reappeared. The same values reinforced themselves. Guests grew accustomed to moderation, to patience, to subtlety. What once seemed austere became comfortable. What once felt limiting came to feel secure. Taste, properly learned, did not feel restrictive. It felt inevitable. This education extended beyond Caroline's own circles. Hosts modeled her standards elsewhere. Guests carried them into other rooms. Her approach replicated itself organically. Taste became standardized. Divergence became visible. The city learned to recognize refinement not as decoration, but as discipline. Caroline's influence thus reshaped aspiration. Those seeking legitimacy no longer pursued grandeur. They pursued alignment. Excess lost its appeal. Novelty became suspect. The highest compliment became invisibility, the ability to belong without being noticed. This was not aesthetic tyranny. It was stabilization. Taste in Caroline's system served a structural function. It reduced friction. It prevented competition from escalating into chaos. It aligned behavior across disparate fortunes. It allowed society to function smoothly despite enormous disparities in wealth and power. Critics mistook this for conservatism. In truth, it was adaptation. The Gilded Age required a new language of refinement, one capable of absorbing rapid change without losing coherence. Caroline provided that language not through doctrine, but through example. Her education of taste succeeded because it respected dignity. No one was shamed publicly. No one was corrected openly. Those who learned did so quietly. Those who did not were not expelled. They were simply placed elsewhere. The system preserved hierarchy without cruelty, coherence without coercion. By the time the city recognized that its idea of good taste bore Caroline Astor's imprint, it was too late to imagine an alternative. Taste had become infrastructure, and like all effective infrastructure, it functioned best when no one remembered who had built it. The final refinement of authority is disappearance. By the time Caroline Astor's influence reached maturity, it no longer required recognition to function. Her presence was no longer necessary for her standards to be enforced. The system had learned itself. Society moved according to patterns she had established long before, repeating them without instruction, defending them without prompting. Power had become invisible. This was not decline. It was completion. Earlier forms of authority relied on visibility, on command, on spectacle, on repetition. Caroline's authority did the opposite. It receded. Decisions no longer needed to be traced back to her. Hosts knew instinctively whom to invite. Guests knew where they belonged. Exclusion occurred without consultation. Inclusion proceeded without approval. The machinery ran smoothly because its logic had been absorbed. Invisibility was the mark of success. When rules must be enforced, they are fragile. When they are internalized, they endure. Caroline had transformed social discipline from something imposed into something inherited. New generations did not ask why things were done a certain way. They simply recognized when something felt wrong. That recognition was her legacy. People continued to speak of her name, but increasingly as reference rather than authority. Standards were described as how things are done, not as her preferences. This distinction mattered. It meant her power could no longer be challenged because it no longer appeared personal. One cannot rebel against atmosphere. Even those who resented the system struggled to locate its source. There was no figure to confront, no decree to overturn. Complaints sounded abstract, unfocused. Criticism lacked target. Caroline had removed herself so thoroughly from the mechanism of control that opposition had nothing to push against. This invisibility also protected her from decline. Public figures fade, institutions erode, personal authority weakens with age. Caroline's influence avoided these vulnerabilities by dissolving into structure. It did not depend on her vitality. It did not require her presence. It survived because it had ceased to be identified as hers. She had become redundant by design. This redundancy was not loss, it was triumph. The city no longer needed to ask her opinion because it already knew how she would respond. Predictability, once associated with limitation, had become comfort. Stability had replaced uncertainty. Invisibility altered how power was perceived. Those within the system stopped thinking of themselves as subjects. They thought of themselves as participants in something natural. Boundaries felt self-evident. Hierarchies felt inevitable. The system no longer felt imposed, it felt correct. This was the most enduring form of control. Caroline did not need to defend her legacy because it was not framed as legacy. It existed as habit. It shaped expectations quietly. Even those who arrived long after her influence peaked found themselves behaving according to rules they had never been taught. They learned by sensing friction, a comment that fell flat, an invitation that never came, an association that stalled advancement. These signals guided behavior without explanation. The system corrected itself continuously, without supervision. Power had vanished into pattern. This invisibility also masked responsibility. No one could say who decided what anymore. Judgment appeared collective, even though its logic traced back to a single mind. This diffusion of responsibility protected the system from moral scrutiny. It felt impersonal, necessary, simply the way things were. Caroline Astor had achieved what few ever do. She had built an authority so complete that it no longer needed her. When power becomes invisible, it becomes permanent. And in the final years of her influence, as society continued to move smoothly within the boundaries she had drawn, Caroline Astor no longer ruled New York. She was New York, rendered silent, structural, and unseen. Every absolute reign ends not with collapse, but with normalization. By the time Caroline Astor's authority approached its close, there was no moment that could be called its decline. Nothing broke, nothing rebelled. Society did not overturn her standards. It continued to follow them without needing her to be present. This was not erosion, it was absorption. Her power had completed its transformation. What once required her attention now required only memory. Hosts replicated her judgment instinctively. Guests carried her expectations into rooms she would never enter. Even absence had lost its drama. The system no longer waited for her because it no longer needed to. This was the paradox of her success. To rule absolutely was to make oneself unnecessary. Caroline did not resist this outcome. She had never sought personal dominance, only coherence. As age narrowed her participation, nothing unraveled. Seasons unfolded as they always had. Invitations circulated predictably, hierarchies held. The quiet machinery she had built continued to function without supervision. Her retreat was gradual, almost imperceptible. She did not withdraw in protest or fatigue. She simply appeared less often. Her name was still spoken, but increasingly as precedent rather than presence. Decisions were justified by reference to how it has always been done, not by appeal to her opinion. Authority had shifted fully from person to pattern. This transition revealed the nature of her reign. It had never depended on charisma, fear, or persuasion. It depended on internalization. Society had learned her rules so completely that it no longer recognized them as rules. They felt like reality. Those who had once feared exclusion now enforced boundaries themselves. Those who had once sought approval now embodied the standards that conferred it. The system had reproduced its own custodians. Caroline's disappearance from daily influence did not free society. It fixed it. Critics who had waited for her absence to loosen hierarchy were disappointed. Nothing softened. Nothing widened. The 400 remained a concept long after the woman associated with it ceased to matter. Exclusion continued, quieter than ever. Admission remained rare, procedural, and unexplained. This endurance unsettled some. It became clear that Caroline Astor had not been an anomaly. She had been a solution to a problem that had not vanished with her. New York would always generate excess. It would always require limitation. If not through her, then through someone shaped by the standards she left behind. Yet, no successor emerged, not because no one tried, but because succession itself contradicted the form of power she had perfected. A visible replacement would have exposed the structure. It would have invited contest. Caroline's authority did not pass to another person because it no longer belonged to one. It belonged to habit. Her legacy was not a lineage of rulers, but a template of restraint. The city had learned to govern itself socially, using cues she had taught it to recognize. Her reign ended not with a handover, but with silence. Silence, once her greatest instrument, became her final state. She left behind no manifesto, no institution bearing her name, no doctrine to be debated. What remained was far more durable, a collective understanding of who belonged, who did not, and how that distinction would be maintained without ever being spoken, aloud. Caroline Astor's rule ended the only way it could. It dissolved into the city. And long after her presence faded, New York continued to behave as though she were still watching, not because she was feared, but because she had taught it how to watch itself. The departure of a ruler often creates a vacuum. Caroline Astor left behind none. What remained after her was not confusion, nor opportunity, nor rebellion, but continuity. The rules she had refined did not loosen in her absence. They hardened. They became less personal, more procedural. What had once required her intuition now relied on repetition. What had once depended on her presence now functioned as instinct. This was not decay. It was ossification. Society did not mourn her authority because it had already internalized it. There were no meetings to reconsider standards, no debates over admission, no reassessments of hierarchy. The system continued uninterrupted, as though nothing essential had changed, because nothing essential had. The difference lay in tone. Without Caroline Astor, judgment lost its human center. It became colder, more automatic. Where she had once exercised discretion, others applied precedent. Where she had softened transitions, the system now enforced them mechanically. What had been quiet now became silent. What had been guided now simply occurred. The rules no longer waited. Hosts no longer hesitated, wondering how she might respond. They acted. Guest lists were trimmed decisively. Invitations disappeared without explanation. Absences multiplied. The ambiguity that had once allowed hope to linger thinned into finality. This was the cost of permanence. Caroline had moderated exclusion with timing, patience, and personal calibration. The system she left behind lacked these subtleties. It preserved boundaries, but not mercy. The rules remained, but the hand that once adjusted them was gone. And yet, no one challenged them. To do so would have required identifying where authority now lived. But authority had dispersed. It existed in habit, in memory, in shared expectation. No single figure could be confronted because no single figure controlled it. The rules belonged to everyone and therefore to no one. This diffusion made resistance impossible. Those excluded could not point to a gatekeeper. Those admitted could not claim privilege openly. The system operated through assumption rather than decree. One behaved correctly not because one was told to, but because deviation felt immediately conspicuous. Society had become self-policing. This transformation altered ambition. Without Caroline as a focal point, aspiration lost direction. There was no one to impress, no one to persuade, no one whose favor could be courted deliberately. Advancement depended entirely on alignment, slow, unspoken, and often unrecognized until long after it had occurred. The ambitious grew quieter. They learned that performance no longer moved boundaries. Display no longer. Advanced position. Only patience remained effective, and patience offered no guarantees. Many simply withdrew, redirecting their energies elsewhere, recognizing that the social order had become impermeable. This impermeability stabilized New York's elite. The 400, once a living concept, hardened into myth. Membership became less flexible, less responsive to change. The rules continued to function, but they no longer adapted easily. What Caroline had managed with judgment, the system now enforced with inertia. And still, no one dared dismantle it. The rules worked too well. They reduced uncertainty. They preserved distinction. They spared society from endless evaluation. Even those disadvantaged by them benefited from clarity. Knowing one's limits, however painful, proved preferable to endless striving. Caroline Astor had solved a problem the city did not know how to solve without her. After the Queen, the rules remained, not as tribute, but as necessity. They outlived her because they answered a permanent need, the need to decide who mattered in a world where too many people demanded to matter at once. Her reign ended. Her system did not. It settled into the city like stone, silent, structural, and impossible to move without rebuilding everything around it. Once authority lost its figure, society lost its reflection. Caroline Astor had given New York a face, calm, restrained, unmistakably human. In her absence, the system endured, but it no longer looked back at those within it. There was no expression to read, no silence to interpret, no presence to calibrate against. Society continued to function, but it did so without gaze or gesture. Judgment became faceless. Decisions arrived without explanation and without hesitation. Invitations ceased without warning. Advancement stalled without cause. No one could say who had decided, only that something had been decided. This anonymity intensified the system's power while stripping it of intimacy. Where Caroline's authority had felt discerning, the rules now felt absolute. The social world adjusted accordingly. People became more cautious, less expressive, more conservative in every sense. Without a human arbiter to absorb tension, behavior hardened. Restraint no longer felt elegant, it felt necessary. Silence no longer suggested confidence, it suggested survival. Society learned to anticipate punishment without ever seeing it. This anticipation shaped behavior more effectively than enforcement ever could. People corrected themselves before correction became visible. They avoided associations preemptively. They softened opinions before anyone could object. The system trained its participants to self-censor reflexively. Caroline had taught restraint through example. The faceless system enforced it through fear of error. This shift altered the emotional texture of elite life. Gatherings became quieter, more controlled, less spontaneous. Humor narrowed. Experimentation vanished. Taste, once cultivated through subtle variation, froze into orthodoxy. What Caroline had balanced with judgment, the system now preserved through rigidity. And yet, this rigidity was welcomed. Certainty, even oppressive certainty, proved preferable to ambiguity. The faceless system offered predictability. It spared society from negotiation. It ended debate before it could begin. In an age already exhausted by complexity, this simplicity felt merciful. The cost was warmth. Without a central figure to humanize power, relationships grew transactional. Inclusion became procedural. Belonging felt thinner. One could not appeal to anyone, only comply. Sympathy, once part of Caroline's private calculus, disappeared entirely. Still, no one sought to restore a face to authority. To do so would have required acknowledging the system as artificial, and that recognition threatened its legitimacy. As long as power appeared impersonal, it could be endured. Personhood invited resentment. Anonymity invited resignation. The city accepted this trade. Society without a face was colder, but it was efficient. It preserved hierarchy without spectacle. It discouraged ambition without confrontation. It functioned as Caroline had designed it to function, only now stripped of the discretion that had once softened its edges. Her absence revealed the full weight of her influence. She had not merely governed behavior. She had moderated its consequences. Without her, the system she left behind continued to operate, but without mercy, without adjustment, without pause. This was the final irony of her reign. In making authority invisible, she ensured its permanence. In stepping away, she exposed what invisibility cost. Society endured, but it did so with less grace, less warmth, and less humanity than it had possessed under her watch. Caroline Astor had ruled without a crown. After her, the crown vanished entirely. What remained was order, efficient, silent, and impersonal, governing a society that no longer needed a queen, only rules it could no longer see, but could never escape. There are inheritances that arrive without ceremony. They do not come with documents, nor with declarations, nor with any clear acknowledgement of receipt. They settle instead into behavior, into reflex, into what feels normal. Caroline Astor left behind such an inheritance, and because no one was named to receive it, everyone did. The system she built did not belong to a successor, it belonged to habit. Families continued to act as though boundaries were self-evident. Hosts curated guest lists with an intuition they could not explain. Exclusion felt procedural rather than personal, inclusion conditional rather than earned. No one paused to ask who had authorized these decisions. Authority no longer required ownership. This inheritance was powerful precisely because it was unclaimed. A claimed inheritance invites challenge. It invites comparison, resentment, and the possibility of refusal. An unclaimed one cannot be contested because it does not announce itself. It operates through assumption, not permission. Those who lived within it did not feel governed. They felt oriented. Orientation replaced leadership. Without a central figure to interpret standards, society relied increasingly on precedent. What had been done before would be done again. What had worked would be repeated. Change slowed not because it was forbidden, but because no mechanism remained to adjust it delicately. Caroline's judgment had once allowed evolution without disruption. Her absence converted evolution into inertia. Yet this inertia was mistaken for tradition. People spoke of customs as though they had always existed, even when they could trace them only a generation back. Memory compressed, origins blurred. What Caroline had introduced as solutions to specific pressures hardened into assumed truths. This is how systems survive their creators. They shed context and retain form. Those who benefited most from this inheritance were those already aligned with it. They moved easily within its contours, rarely noticing its limits because they did not press against them. Those less aligned encountered resistance they could not locate. Doors closed without explanation. Advancement stalled without cause. Frustration grew quietly but without focus. There was no person to blame, no decision to appeal. Grievance scattered rather than gathered. Each disappointment appeared isolated, personal, unfortunate. The inheritance protected itself by denying coherence to dissent. And still, no one claimed it. To do so would have required admitting that power was being exercised at all. Better to pretend the system was neutral, that outcomes were organic, that belonging emerged naturally. This fiction allowed everyone to participate without confronting their role in maintaining exclusion. Caroline Astor had understood this necessity. A system that survives must convince its participants that it is not a system. It must appear inevitable, unchosen, simply the way things are done. Her greatest achievement was not control, but concealment. The inheritance she left behind was not authority. It was certainty. Certainty about who mattered, certainty about where limits lay, certainty that deviation would be noticed, even if no one could say by whom. This certainty guided behavior more effectively than any command ever could. Over time, this inheritance grew heavier. As generations passed, fewer people remembered its origin. Fewer still understood its purpose. What remained was a rigid structure without explanation, a hierarchy defended by familiarity rather than conviction. The absence of a living arbiter made adjustment nearly impossible. And yet, the inheritance endured. It endured because it answered a permanent anxiety, the fear of indistinction. In a world that produced too much wealth, too much visibility, too many claimants to importance, the system offered relief. It said enough. It said, here are the limits. It said, you are either inside or you are not. No one claimed this inheritance, but everyone lived under it. And in that quiet acceptance, Caroline Astor's influence continued, not as memory, not as legend, but as structure, shaping lives long after her name had ceased to be spoken with reverence or even recognition at all. To live inside a system that decides for you is to be spared choice and charged for it later. The social order Caroline Astor left behind offered certainty, but certainty came at a price that revealed itself only over time. Lives unfolded along invisible tracks, guided by expectations that felt natural, but allowed little deviation. People learned early where they stood, and later discovered how difficult it was to move. This was the quiet cost of having one's place decided. For those securely inside the structure, life became predictable. Marriages aligned sensibly. Invitations arrived reliably. Associations followed established paths. There was comfort in this arrangement, a sense of safety that required no effort to maintain. One did not need to evaluate endlessly. The system evaluated for you. Yet, Predictability dulled possibility. Choices narrowed without appearing to do so. Certain ambitions were never considered. Certain connections were never attempted, not because they were forbidden, but because they felt inappropriate. The system did not prohibit desire, it redirected it until it conformed. Those outside felt the cost differently. They experienced uncertainty rather than stability, but their uncertainty was bounded. They learned where aspiration stalled. They adjusted expectations downward. Many stopped striving altogether, not from despair, but from clarity. The system spared them endless hope, but it also denied them surprise. Being decided meant being known in advance. The city anticipated behavior before it occurred. Deviations were corrected gently, often before they became visible. People learned to anticipate judgment and avoid it. This anticipation shaped personality itself. Risk-taking declined, experimentation faded, originality learned to disguise itself as tradition. Even rebellion became cautious. Those who pushed against the structure did so subtly, testing limits without crossing them. Outright defiance was rare, not because it was punished harshly, but because it was absorbed and neutralized. The system did not crush resistance, it rendered it irrelevant. This had profound psychological consequences. People ceased to ask who they might become and focused instead on how well they fit. Identity shifted from aspiration to alignment. Success meant comfort within boundaries, not expansion beyond them. The highest achievement became invisibility, moving through the system without friction. Caroline Astor had not intended this as cruelty. She had sought order in an age of excess, stability in a city overwhelmed by choice. But order, once established, resists revision. Stability, once achieved, fears disruption. The system she created protected itself by narrowing what was conceivable. The cost of being decided was subtle. It appeared as politeness rather than prohibition, as guidance rather than command, as habit rather than rule. And because it was subtle, it was rarely questioned. People accepted the limits placed upon them because those limits felt familiar, even comforting. Only occasionally did someone notice the absence, a life path unexplored, a possibility quietly abandoned, a curiosity dismissed as impractical. These losses were never named as losses. They were absorbed into the narrative of suitability. One did not lament what one had never been encouraged to imagine, yet the system's greatest cost was collective. By deciding too much, it reduced adaptability. It preserved hierarchy at the expense of renewal. Over time, the social order grew brittle, resistant to change not because change was harmful, but because the mechanisms for adjusting had been forgotten. Caroline Astor had once provided those mechanisms through judgment, timing, and discretion. Without her, the system retained structure but lost flexibility. It continued to decide, but without the capacity to reconsider. The cost of being decided then was not oppression. It was stagnation. And stagnation, unlike chaos, reveals itself slowly, only after the world outside has moved on, leaving a perfectly ordered society standing still, uncertain why its certainty no longer serves it as it once did. Order, once established, does not know when to release itself. The system Caroline Astor shaped had solved a specific problem: how to contain excess in a city overwhelmed by wealth, ambition, and novelty. It restored legibility where chaos threatened to erase distinction. It slowed motion, it disciplined appetite, it allowed society to breathe again. But problems change. As decades passed, the conditions that had demanded such rigid order began to soften. Wealth diversified, cities expanded, social influence fractured across new institutions, universities, professions, cultural movements that did not require drawing rooms to function. The world Caroline had stabilized no longer existed in the same form. Yet, the order remained. It persisted not because it still served its original purpose, but because it had become habitual. What had once been corrective hardened into reflex. Boundaries designed to manage overflow now restricted movement unnecessarily. Hierarchies meant to preserve coherence began to inhibit adaptation. This was not immediately obvious. Order often feels virtuous long after it has ceased to be useful. Its presence reassures, its familiarity comforts. People confuse endurance with relevance, mistaking longevity for wisdom. The system continued to decide who belonged long after belonging itself had changed meaning. The elite sensed something amiss but lacked language for it. They noticed declining influence beyond their circles. Cultural authority shifted elsewhere, toward new forms of visibility that did not require sanction. Yet within their own world, the rules persisted unchanged. Invitations still mattered, absences still signaled judgment. The structure held, even as its reach diminished. Order had outlived its purpose, but dismantling it felt impossible. To question the system was to question the very habits that defined identity. Who were they, if not the people shaped by these rules? What remained of status if the standards governing it were obsolete? The cost of revision felt greater than the cost of stagnation. Thus, society chose familiarity. It continued to enforce distinctions that no longer structured the world beyond its walls. The rules became increasingly inward-facing, regulating a shrinking domain. Outside, influence dispersed freely. Inside, order tightened defensively. Caroline Astor's system had never been designed for expansion. It had been designed for containment, and containment, when preserved beyond necessity, becomes confinement. This produced a subtle dissonance. Members of the elite felt both secure and irrelevant, protected within a structure that no longer shaped the broader culture. They retained privilege, but lost direction. The rules remained, but their consequences diminished. Yet no one could say when the shift had occurred. There was no single moment when order became excess. It happened gradually, invisibly, through repetition unexamined. The system continued to function flawlessly, even as the world it governed moved elsewhere. This was the final limitation of Caroline Astor's achievement. She had built something perfectly suited to its time and too successful to adapt afterward. Her order endured precisely because it resisted change. What had once been its strength became its constraint. Still, the odd system did not collapse. It lingered, self-contained, regulating those who continued to value its approval. It mattered deeply to fewer people, but mattered absolutely within its remaining domain. Order rarely disappears. It contracts. Caroline Astor had restored balance to a city in flux. What followed was not failure, but obsolescence. And obsolescence, unlike defeat, does not announce itself. It simply waits, intact, impeccable, and increasingly out of step until the world no longer needs what it so carefully preserves. Elegance has a way of surviving its own necessity. Long after the conditions that demanded refinement have vanished, refinement remains, polished, practiced, and increasingly detached from consequence. This was the state into which Caroline Astor's world finally settled, elegant, disciplined, and no longer central to the forces shaping the age. The rituals continued. Dinners were still timed precisely. Conversation remained measured. Appearances were managed with care. The gestures of belonging persisted, because they had been perfected over generations. To abandon them would have felt like self-erasure. Elegance had become identity. Yet, outside these rooms, the world had changed its vocabulary. Influence no longer required invitation. Recognition no longer passed through drawing rooms. New centers of authority emerged, professional, cultural, technological, each indifferent to the codes that had once governed legitimacy. The social order Caroline Astor built did not collapse under this shift. It simply ceased to matter beyond its own perimeter. Inside, nothing appeared different. Those who remained within the system continued to behave as though relevance endured. They dressed as before, spoke as before, judged as before. The language of inclusion and exclusion remained fluent. The rules were enforced with the same quiet precision. Elegance performed itself flawlessly, but performance without audience is preservation, not power. This realization unsettled some and reassured others. For many, the shrinking of relevance felt like protection. The outside world appeared noisy, uncertain, ungoverned. Inside, elegance still promised control. It preserved a sense of superiority even as it lost its ability to shape outcomes. Elegance after relevance becomes inward-looking. It values purity over impact, continuity over adaptation. Deviations feel threatening, not because they disrupt order, but because they reveal how little order now controls. The system tightens its grip on those who remain, demanding greater conformity as compensation for diminished reach. This contraction was quiet. No announcements marked the shift. No acknowledgments admitted it. Elegance continued to assert itself as though nothing had changed. The absence of external consequence made internal discipline feel even more important. If the system could no longer rule the city, it would rule itself perfectly, Caroline. Astor's legacy persisted most strongly here. She had taught society how to value restraint for its own sake. That lesson endured even when restraint ceased to be strategic. Elegance became ritualized, severed from function. It no longer decided who mattered in the world, only who mattered within its walls. For those raised inside this order, this felt natural. They had learned to measure worth through subtlety, silence, and alignment. The loss of broader influence did not feel like loss at all. It felt like refinement reaching its purest form, self-contained, insulated, and immune to external judgment. For outsiders, the elegance appeared theatrical, impressive, perhaps even admirable, but irrelevant. The codes no longer translated. The distinctions no longer signaled power. What had once governed New York now governed only memory and ritual. Yet, elegance did not protest this fate. It never does. Elegance adapts by narrowing its audience, not by changing its rules. It survives by becoming heritage rather than authority. Caroline Astor's system did exactly this, retreating into itself, flawless in form, emptied of function, and perfectly preserved. This was not tragedy. It was completion. Elegance, after relevance, becomes its own justification. And in that final transformation, Caroline Astor's world achieved a strange immortality, not as power, but as posture, still practiced, still revered, long after the city had learned to live without needing its permission. What survives longest is not power, but the story told about it. As Caroline Astor's world receded from consequence into ceremony, memory began its quiet work. Details softened, motives simplified, complexity gave way to coherence. What had once been a living system, adaptive, strategic, responsive, was polished into myth, smooth enough to be admired without being questioned. Memory prefers elegance to accuracy. The rules that once required vigilance were recalled as tradition. The exclusions that once demanded calibration were remembered as taste. The discipline that had stabilized a volatile age was reframed as natural superiority. In recollection, nothing appeared provisional. Everything seemed inevitable. This was comforting. Myth spares its audience from discomfort. It removes contingency. It suggests that things were always destined to be as they were, and therefore absolves everyone involved from responsibility. Caroline Astor's authority, once subtle and deliberate, became legend, fixed, benevolent, and complete. The myth required simplification. Her silences were remembered as dignity, her restraint as kindness, her boundaries as wisdom. The harder truths, the quiet violence of exclusion, the anxiety of arrival, the cost of being decided, were softened or omitted entirely. Memory retained the glow and released the weight. Society assisted eagerly. Those who had benefited from the system found reassurance in its mythologizing. Today, remember the past as refined rather than restrictive, validated their inheritance. To celebrate elegance without examining its function preserved identity without requiring reflection. Critique became impolite. To question the myth was to disturb the calm surface of nostalgia. It introduced friction where none was desired. As a result, dissent retreated into academic language or private conversation, stripped of urgency. The myth grew safer as it grew more distant. Caroline Astor became a symbol rather than a strategist. She was remembered as a figure of taste rather than a mind of control. Her name conjured ballrooms and chandeliers, not boundaries and arithmetic. The list became anecdote. The 400 became trivia. The system became ambiance. This transformation protected the past from scrutiny. Myth renders power inert. It allows admiration without consequence. One can praise without inheriting responsibility. The system that once disciplined behavior could now be referenced fondly without being reenacted in full. And yet, traces remained. Even as the myth settled, habits endured. The reflexes Carolyn had taught did not vanish with her legend. They lived on in subtle preferences, in inherited discomforts, in instincts that felt personal but were, in fact, learned. Memory polished the surface, but structure persisted beneath it. This coexistence produced a peculiar tension. People celebrated the myth while unconsciously practicing its remnants. They spoke of openness while enforcing familiarity. They praised merit while privileging continuity. The myth allowed contradiction to pass unnoticed. Myth also fixed Carolyn Astor in time. She became emblematic of an era rather than a participant within it. Her decisions were no longer contextualized by the pressures she navigated. They were admired abstractly, detached from the problem they had solved. This detachment preserved reverence at the cost of understanding. Understanding would have complicated the story. It would have required acknowledging that the myth arose from necessity, not virtue. That elegance was a response to excess. That order was imposed because disorder threatened everyone involved. Myth prefers purity. History offers contingency. Society chose the former. Thus, Carolyn Astor endured not as she had been, but as memory required her to be. A queen of refinement, a guardian of taste, a symbol of grace. The strategist vanished. In this final transformation, her power reached its most durable form, not as authority, not as system, but as story, polished, admired, and safe enough to repeat without ever asking what it once demanded or from whom. Long after the myth settled, something remained that could not be named. It lingered not in stories, nor in portraits, nor even in tradition, but in reaction. In the subtle sense that something was off before anyone could explain why. This was the ghost standard, the residue of Caroline Astor's authority, detached from memory yet still active, guiding judgment without ever revealing its source. People felt it before they understood it, a gathering that seemed excessive, a voice that lingered too long, a display that crossed an invisible line. No rule had been broken, no precedent cited. Yet discomfort appeared instantly, shared and unspoken. The room adjusted. Attention withdrew. The correction occurred without instruction. The ghost standard had spoken. Unlike the original system, it did not organize society openly. It did not sort families or define membership. It functioned more quietly now, embedded in instinct. It shaped taste, not status. It governed tone rather than access. But its authority was no less real for being diffuse. This standard was not taught. It was inherited indirectly, through posture, pacing, silence, and restraint modeled across generations. Children absorbed it before they could articulate it. They learned what felt right long before they learned why. Correction arrived as discomfort rather than discipline. This made the ghost standard resilient. One cannot argue with instinct. One can only suppress it, and suppression requires effort. Many did not bother. It was easier to align unconsciously than to challenge something so indistinct. The standard survived because it required no defense. Ironically, it outlived the structure that created it. The 400 faded. The drawing rooms lost relevance. The explicit hierarchies softened. Yet the ghost standard continued to operate, trimming excess, flattening ambition, discouraging display. It had shed its social function and retained its psychological one. Elegance became reflex. People moderated themselves even when moderation no longer conferred advantage. They avoided extremes without knowing why. They felt embarrassment in situations where none was required. The standard no longer protected hierarchy, it protected identity. This produced quiet confusion. New generations inherited discomfort without context. They felt the weight of judgment, but could not locate its origin. They sensed boundaries, but could not name them. The ghost standard governed without explanation, creating friction between instinct and intention. Some mistook this for taste, others mistook it for anxiety. In truth, it was memory without narrative, a system stripped of justification but still exerting pressure. Carolyn Astor's influence had receded so completely that it no longer appeared historical. It felt personal, internal, self-generated. This was her most enduring achievement. By removing authority from visibility, she had ensured its survival beyond relevance. Even when society no longer needed her solutions, it continued to react as though it did. The ghost standard persisted not because it was enforced, but because it felt familiar. Familiarity is difficult to dismantle. To reject the ghost standard required conscious effort, to question instinct, to tolerate discomfort, to risk appearing excessive. Few were willing. Restraint felt safer. Silence felt correct. The ghost standard rewarded compliance with ease, and yet its presence exacted a cost. Without context, restraint became inhibition. Without purpose, discipline became anxiety. The standard no longer solved a problem. It lingered as a habit detached from necessity. It shaped behavior without offering clarity. Caroline Astor had once wielded judgment deliberately. The ghost standard wielded it automatically. This was the final transformation of her power, not into myth, not into tradition, but into reflex, a system no longer recognized as external, yet still shaping internal response. A queen long gone, a throne long dissolved, and still the standard remained, unseen, unquestioned, and quietly deciding how far one could go before the room grew cold. To live under an unseen inheritance is to mistake habit for choice. Those shaped by the ghost standard rarely recognized it as something external. It felt internal, personal preference, natural modesty, instinctive caution. People described themselves as reserved, selective, understated, without realizing how precisely these traits mirrored an older discipline designed for a different world. The inheritance did not announce itself as constraint. It appeared as comfort. Silence felt safer than expression. Restraint felt wiser than enthusiasm. Moderation felt superior to excess. These values were not questioned because they had been absorbed too early to feel imposed. They arrived before reflection, before self-awareness, before the possibility of refusal. This was the quiet power of Caroline Astor's legacy. She had not merely shaped behavior. She had shaped the emotional cost of deviation. Those who strayed from the inherited standard experienced unease, not social punishment, but internal friction. A sense of having misjudged tone, of having revealed too much, of having crossed a line no one could point to. Correction came from within. This internalization made the inheritance difficult to dismantle. One could challenge an institution, one could argue with a rule. But how does one argue with instinct? How does one identify a boundary that exists only as sensation? Many never tried. They adjusted themselves instead. They softened edges preemptively. They edited speech before it left the mouth. They chose invisibility over risk. The inheritance trained them to value harmony above authenticity, composure above clarity. This training was not uniform. Some felt its weight more acutely than others. Those whose temperaments leaned toward expression experienced constant self-monitoring. Those inclined toward ambition felt a persistent drag, a sense that wanting too much was somehow improper. The inheritance did not prevent desire, but it made desire uncomfortable. And discomfort is persuasive. The ghost standard also altered how people interpreted success. Achievement that arrived quietly felt legitimate. Achievement that announced itself felt suspect. Praise was accepted only if delivered obliquely. Recognition was safest when it could be denied. In this way, Caroline Astor's system continued to privilege understatement long after understatement ceased to serve any structural function. The inheritance survived because it aligned with fear. Fear of exposure, fear of excess, fear of standing out in the wrong way. These fears had once protected social order. Now they protected emotional equilibrium. People complied not to maintain hierarchy, but to avoid internal dissonance. Occasionally, someone noticed the pattern. They recognized that the discomfort they felt was learned, not innate. That restraint was not always virtue. That silence did not always signal wisdom. Such recognition produced a brief moment of clarity and then resistance. because clarity demanded choice. To step outside the inheritance required tolerance for discomfort without reassurance. It required the willingness to appear excessive, improper, or misaligned, labels that carried residual weight even when stripped of meaning. Few were willing to bear that cost consistently. Thus, the inheritance endured, not through enforcement, but through fatigue. It was easier to conform than to question, easier to inherit than to invent. Caroline Astor's influence had achieved its most complete form, a system that governed without appearing to govern, endured without being named, and shaped lives without being acknowledged. People lived under it without knowing they did. They believed they were choosing restraint, when restraint had chosen them. This was the final refinement of power, not rule, not memory, not myth, but temperament itself, altered by a discipline so old it felt natural. And in that quiet, unquestioned continuation, Caroline Astor's legacy persisted, no longer as a queen, nor even as a standard, but as an atmosphere that followed people into rooms where her name had long since faded from the walls. The final lesson of Caroline Astor's reign was never taught directly. It emerged only after everything else had faded, after the list dissolved into anecdote, after the 400 became a curiosity, after elegance lost its authority and memory polished power into myth. What remained was not instruction, but consequence. A society shaped too well will forget how to choose. Caroline Astor had solved the problem of excess by narrowing the field of possibility. She had taught restraint to an age intoxicated by abundance. She had restored legibility where chaos threatened meaning. These achievements were real, necessary, and brilliant. But they carried a quiet after-effect, one she never articulated, and perhaps never intended. When judgment becomes invisible, discernment atrophies. Generations raised within her system learned to recognize correctness without understanding its purpose. They sensed boundaries without knowing why those boundaries existed. They inherited reactions without inheriting reasoning. The result was a refinement that could identify deviation, but struggled to articulate value. People knew when something felt wrong. They did not always know what felt right. This was the cost of perfect guidance. When authority absorbs too much responsibility, those within it stop practicing decision. They adapt, they align, they self-correct. But they do not choose freely. Over time, this produces a peculiar fragility, a dependence on standards whose origins are forgotten and whose relevance can no longer be tested. Caroline Astor's final lesson was this fragility, not as failure, but as consequence. She had built a system so effective that it removed the necessity of judgment from most lives it governed. That system endured precisely because it demanded so little conscious participation. But when the world changed, as it always does, the inherited instincts struggled to adapt. Restraint persisted where expression was required. Silence lingered where clarity was needed. Elegance remained where courage might have served better. The lesson, then, was not about hierarchy or exclusion or taste. It was about balance. Order can stabilize a moment, but only choice can sustain a future. Caroline Astor never spoke this lesson because she did not need to. Her age demanded containment, not liberation. Her task was to slow a city moving too fast, to discipline an elite drowning in possibility. She accomplished this flawlessly. What followed was not her responsibility. Yet, history reveals what structure alone cannot, that systems must eventually teach their participants how to outgrow them. Caroline's system taught obedience, alignment, and restraint, but it did not teach departure. The last lesson, unspoken and unresolved, was left to those who came after. To recognize when instinct no longer serves intention, to distinguish between elegance and inhibition, to choose deliberately what had once been inherited unconsciously. This was the final inheritance of her reign, not a rule, not a myth, not even a standard, but a question that lingered after everything else had settled. When the room grows quiet and restraint arrives automatically and silence feels correct. Is it wisdom guiding you? Or is it merely the echo of a queen who taught the world how to be still and never told it how to move again?